We will get there. So it's lots about patterns, and we're going to talk about the principle of the day is principle 7, and the icon, the image that goes with it, is of a spider's web, and the statement is design from patterns to detail, and the saying is can't see the wood for the trees. The spider's web it's one of nature's patterns, isn't it? In fact, I was reading recently that the spider's web is an extension of the mind of the spider. It represents its thoughts and also its senses, I guess, because it's obviously it's very tuned into whether something else is touching its web. But every spider's web is the same. Sorry, every spider's web is different. It's not the same. Every spider's web is unique because it's a product of the interaction of the individual spider, its species, its variety, its own individuality, and the uniqueness of that moment in time, the place where it's working, the distance between the anchor points of the web. It might break at some point, or be interact with a fly might land in it, or whatever. The wind might blow. There's this uniqueness to each thing. But yet, you can always recognize that it's a spider's web. And that's because you're seeing the pattern, not the detail. You're seeing the sort of the overarching, the sort of pattern archetype. That's kind of a word that I use in this talk. And nature seems to have reoccurring pattern archetypes. We're going to explore 6 of them, and they seem to turn up everywhere pretty much. And that's sort of revealing, that's telling us something. We don't have to even be sure what, but the fact that patterns keep reoccurring, patterns conform to patterns as well, which is it's all really interesting. So it seems to be that this sort of pattern language and pattern forms are hardwired into nature. They spontaneously form. So, and later on, I'm going to direct you to look at a video called The Secret Life of Chaos, which I'm very happy to see is back on YouTube. I put it up myself a few years ago and got censored and told off for doing so. But it's a BBC sort of science documentary with Professor Jim Al-Khalili. It's really cool, and it's really starts to frame some of the fundamental questions that we're asking ourselves in part 2 of the PDC. So yes, welcome to part 2 of the PDC. And you'll notice that the first 6 principles, the part 1 of the PDC, is about observing nature. So we had observe and interact. We had catch and store energy, obtain a yield, systems and limits, use and value natural resources and services, and produce no waste. Now, we sort of skipped over a little bit the last 2, but they're there. And I think we'll maybe squeeze in a session around compost and composting toilets and natural water treatment to really think about the use and value natural resources and services. But we're really interested in is, if you've like those natural processes that complete those cycles, very much so. So that's our first half. Our second half is now about design. It's about how we make sense of the world and how we initiate our own designs. So we're going to go through all into that, and that's really fascinating. So the second half is about how we take our understanding of nature and apply it to the world to create change. And we can do that in a really small way as a way of learning how to do it. That's a really good sort of way to look at it as well. So the real world is really big. Real world is really complex, and it's hard, if you like, to it can be dwarfing and overwhelming to think about how do we change the world. So we try and work by having very focused objectives and working towards those objectives with a kind of with a methodology. Let's just look at some of nature's patterns and realize that these things we've seen. And they come around, and we can think about that a little bit. So this is Romanesque broccoli, a member of the Calabrese family. And what we're seeing is a fractal pattern. And a fractal pattern is a pattern that repeats itself again and again and again, and it is the same pattern but expressed at different scales. This is something that we see a lot in the real world, in the natural world. We see patterns. Sometimes when we're looking down a microscope, we see the same patterns as we see as when we look in a telescope. And these patterns in some ways represent or embody some kind of function, and we're interested in that. This one looks a little bit like the spider's web, but it's a functional pattern that's achieving something different in this case. This is the underside of a lily leaf. And you can imagine, you can just see by looking at it, how that might function. That the lily leaf itself is a respiring, living thing, part of a plant. And so therefore, this CO2 bubbles are coming out from the pores on the underside of this plant leaf. And those bubbles are then being trapped, look, in these little, in the web, three-dimensional web on the underside of the lily leaf, which means that it floats. And there's some lovely pictures I'm sure you've seen of like a little Indian boy sat cross-legged on a big lily leaf. It works, it's very, very effective. And it's interesting to note that we have that same sort of web pattern. That may or may not tell us something. We just think about how obviously that's very functional. And we can also think about how we can look to nature for inspiration. We can see there's a functional pattern here, which might be something even that you might be able to bring into manufacturing or to design to achieve a similar effect. So it's a very clear nature is our teacher kind of components in this. Soap bubbles. Soap bubbles are a sphere, and they're always a sphere because of air pressure. And that's a good, interesting thing to think about. But when we squish them together, if we add some kind of force or kind of gravity, look, this one's a 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes into a pentagram. This one's a 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That goes into a hexagon. That one's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ooh, 7. It's a bit irregular. But we're basically getting 5s and 6s. We've got an irregular pattern. Nature's a bit irregular. If we were to make that, if humans were to make that, to make everything the same, it would be 5s and 6s. So interesting. We're just making observations of patterns. So I think of a mosquito, or some insect. Anyway, interesting. Again, seeing how we've got hexagonals forming the dome for the eye. The tail of a chameleon. Look how this spiral sits within itself so comfortably, so beautifully. So we have a spiral pattern, but also look, we have these sort of almost 5s and 6s again. We have this similar sort of repeating pattern on the actual the skin of the chameleon. So this one pattern, the spiral, is about the shape that fits within itself, and then this other pattern is that the skin of the creature, of the animal that's doing it, is serving a different function. It's got a skin that's flexible in different ways, in different directions, and has some kind of like sort of armored, strengthening values to it. This repeating pattern on a sedum, on a succulent. Yep. I am showing. Yes, there we go. Okay, so yeah. Again, so a simple pattern that repeats, but it repeats to a certain mathematical formula. It's interesting to think about how many petals there are on each iteration of this form. We'll think about that. Is it a dahlia? I think it's a dahlia. Again, we've got a very simple pattern. We call this a lobed pattern maybe, but it's a simple pattern that repeats many, many times, and it gives us a complex structure. Lots of edge. and a certain strength coming from everything standing against everything else touching. But it creates also an enormous amount of edge inside and between. So I think we can consider what function that might be performing for that plant. It says a sundew leaf. These little sticky droplets, sweet, sticky droplets attract insects, which then become entrapped. And the plant can then digest them and obtain their proteins. This is a carnivorous plant. And again, we're seeing that spiral pattern fitting lovely, beautifully within itself. Another repeating simple pattern, this one of hexagons. So if we repeat hexagons, we get a flat surface of basically of cylindrical things pushed together. And yeah, there we go. There's a bee's nest and also wasps and other similar insects. So we've got a matrix of structures that's nearly all holes, but that it creates a lot of strength. There's a lot of strength in this because every surface is attached to the next one around it. Yeah, but it's using the minimum amount of material. Here's a millipede curled up. And again, look, its shell is able to flex in a way, its external coat is able to flex in a way in which it can go into a spiral, it can go into a ball, it can, obviously the most vulnerable part of its body is the underside where its legs are. And so in going into this shape, it's best protected against, I don't know, birds or predators or whatever it is might be trying to eat that millipede. Here's another succulent or a cactus. And again, we've got lovely spirals. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I can't count 6. 1, 2, there, mate. We've got beautiful shape repeating on itself. So there we go. There's just a few that we might observe in nature. Nature's beautiful, complex. We're seeing patterning manifest in many different ways. In some ways relates to form. Okay, so we're going to look at these 6 sort of archetypes and these sort of basic patterns of patterns. And the first one that we're going to identify is the branching pattern. And there's nothing more simple to this, and yet it creates the ultimate complexity. So the branching pattern has 2 rules. One is, so it's very simple. There's our first element. And then when we go to the next layer of this pattern, we double the amount of elements, but we halve the distance. There's a very, very simple mathematical formula for you. So, oops, I didn't mean to do that. So there we go, a single element, and then we doubling it and halving the distance. We can do the same again. Double number of elements, halve the distance, and do that again. Okay, you get it. It's simple, but it's very, very powerful. I'm going to do one more. Okay, I think point is made. So look how quickly this pattern moves from simplicity to complexity. And so our first thought really within this is that there's an absolute relationship within nature between kind of sort of diametric opposites. They're not separate things, that the one's the product of the other. And of course, no, well, yes, hello. Go get your biscuits, go on. Right, snack time for pussycats. So We start with one. We add a very, very simple formula, and then that moves to complexity. And what's more is, it's our pattern. Labouring the same point, maybe our pattern is not completely geometrically perfect because we're interacting with nature, with random things. So, or the steadiness of my hand or whatever. But there we go. Number one. This is a river estuary of a large river entering the Baltic, and we're seeing a branching pattern. There's the main artery of the river, the main channel of the river, and look, as it enters the estuary. I mean, again, let's just think about what's happening. As it enters the estuary, look, here's our main flow, it deposits. It's slowing down, isn't it? The rivers, big rivers, entering the sea, entering the flatter, lower area where there's more friction. And so it's going to deposit some of its sediment. So as it deposits its sediment, it's going to flow either side of it. So if you like, it's creating, then it goes from one element to two. And then that same pattern, that same process repeats and repeats and repeats. So we get our branching pattern. And what's also interesting is we can look out over here on this side, on the left-hand side of the photo, and we can see that the river's obviously done that here, and it's branched and branched and branched, and then created these sort of wetlands, and then that process now has sort of moved over to the right, and then maybe it's sort of, you can imagine it, I don't know, sort of constantly changing and evolving and creating more and more complexity. But again, it's a very simple, the same processes that are creating the pattern. If we made a second observation, it's that look how where all the branches were, we're left with this, again, really interestingly complex, beautiful meanders of rivers, but also loads and loads of little lakes, which almost looks like a little kind of almost like a spongy texture, doesn't it? We've got lots and lots of little round lakes, as well as all these rivulets. So I don't know if there's a relationship between those two forms, but we're just making observations. And look, even right at the very end, right out here, the same pattern, the same process is happening. The rivers keep subdividing and subdividing, which creates, again, a lot of edge, a lot of interactions. You can imagine this would be a very productive, complex, full of life area. Very, very valuable. Here's our branching of our arteries and veins within our body, distributing, creating surface area, allowing obviously nutrients and gaseous exchange within our body. And then look at how these lymph nodes, so we get branching and branching and branching, but we've also still got these round, spongy sort of looking structures. You know, we just think about how the same patterns form, even though they're in very, very different conditions. So there's something universal underneath that. That's, I think, that's a very important thing to note. What we're getting at. There's a beautiful branching pattern. This is the dragon tree in Tenerife. I think the trees are unique to the Canary Islands. I'm not sure, I think so. But here we're seeing an out of the really extreme form of the branching pattern. I think that's really lovely. Is we're moving from simplicity. There's our single trunk, and then look how it divides. We've got a simple division there, where we got sort of three, and then again and again and again. Divisions, branching, until then we get to the end of each branch, and then we've got sort of these sort of multiple stemmed looking leaves. So we look how quickly, again, just mathematically, how we move from the individual, from this single stem to thousands of tiny little leaves. Very, very quick movement from singular to very, very many, from simplicity to complexity. And again, look, it's not totally geometrically perfect, because obviously as these things form, the wind's blowing. Some days are hotter than others. Some days it rains. Some days there's a bird comes along and eats some of the tree or insect or something. So the randomness and the uniqueness of the tree is a product of the fact that that pattern is forming whilst interacting with a ever-changing world, ever-changing unique environment. So look, this is your, if you like, there's the stem that we have almost in common for every origin, you know, from the seed produces that stem. And then, but when, if you look at the manifestation of that as it develops and grows, is that's the uniqueness of your fingerprint, or any other part that we could consider and identify is so back in The Secret Life of Chaos, Professor Kalili talks a lot about this. Really hardwired within nature is simplicity and complexity, and order and chaos. They're not separate things happening side by side. They are the same thing, and that so we can look at this and understand that. Yeah, I know exactly what that is. I can describe it. I can measure it. I can communicate to someone else what that looks like. But I really can't do the same for this because there's so many variables. We can't exactly measure anything, and we can't measure it. Also, in part one, because it's so complex, and two, because it's also constantly changing. So if we were to say, I would like to recreate another dragon tree that is exactly like that one, it's actually impossible, even though the processes that formed it, the mathematics, whatever, the processes are really, really quite simple. So there's our first sort of insight within patterns, is that this relationship between simplicity and complexity, between order and chaos, and that they're both products of the same thing. All of this takes us quite further on as we consider these things. Okay, Kat has now had her breakfast. You'll be happy to hear. She's rejoining the outside world to terrorize birds and small beasts, and probably gain more breakfast from our next door neighbor. Okay, here we go. So look, here's another set of, this is a beech tree, and we've got even more kind of slightly more chaotic and random pattern here. But this illustrates beautifully how, as the pattern's forming, each element is also then reacting to all the other elements, which again creates an absolute uniqueness in every pattern. So here, look, this branch was growing this way. It's been responding to light. That's all it's doing. It's growing in this direction, and it's thinking, or it's responding to the fact that, oh, there's light in this direction. So the branch has now gone this way, advantageously to harvest this light, as has this one. And as they get closer together, they're both now responding to the fact that they're going to shade each other out, and they're going off in the other direction again. And look at that, we're seeing this process of things reacting to each other, and how the pattern expresses itself in a unique way every time, because it's forming and responding to the uniqueness of every moment in time. Hi, John. Yeah. Hi. Let me just pause for 1 moment.
Yeah.
John, how can I help you, my friend?
I came up yesterday.
Yeah.
I just put some more into your upstairs. I'm not staying, but
Okay.
I've got something to do at home. But Boss was sorting out glass.
Okay.
But he got in a bit of a muddle with it. So
Oh.
I gave him Boys and Bowden's
Phone number.
and that.
Yeah.
But I don't know if he sorted it yet. I didn't see him yesterday.
Okay.
When I was here.
Yeah, I did see him yesterday. We didn't talk about it. So
yeah, I'm probably going to pick it up if it's there or whatever. I don't know what's going on with it.
Okay.
He wasn't. I did what I could until
right.
midday,
Okay.
and he still wasn't up.
So do you want me? So I'll get him to call you. Yeah.
Well, just send me a text, whatever.
Yeah, I'll message you. Yeah.
Well, whichever. It doesn't matter. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway.
So, but you're not working today, but you did.
No,
pick up some
I've
bits.
just put another coat of linseed on all woodwork up there.
Cool.
I did a bit of a measure up for the sliding door on the craft shop as well yesterday.
Yeah.
I know it's nothing to do with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no,
but,
sure.
I might as well sort of.
What he's doing, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I put a bit of a barrier across the window upstairs as well.
Oh, brilliant. Okay.
Have a look,
Okay.
It's not. I realised I chopped the banister up to too short.
Oh,
We'll use the banister.
All right. Okay.
For fuck's sake.
Okay.
So I made a piece up out of the the balustrade
Okay.
anyway.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I only got
If-
back this evening.
Yeah,
so,
yeah. If it meets with your approval, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll be back tomorrow.
Okay,
I just want to let you know. And just
I'll give Yossi a
how
shakedown
going,
for what's going on.
and
Yeah.
I'll leave them a note in the shop.
Yeah.
About with a list of things that they need to get.
They won't be there till Thursday, but
That's fine.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll do it tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'll go home and consolidate it now. It might put it in my head.
Okay.
Now.
Nice one, John.
But it needs to be on paper.
Yeah.
How was your course?
Yeah, great. Good.
So I did see you lurking around the garden.
Okay. Yeah.
I was picking raspberries.
Okay.
So I got to be noticed.
All right. Yeah. No, I had a good visit. It was great.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Cheers, John.
Okay, I'll see you tomorrow, Steve.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, that's John, our builder. The builder is helping us, and he lives at the workhouse. So yeah, he saw us lurking around there at the weekend. So yes, back to beech trees. As well, as above, so below. The root systems. Again, it's thinking about that branching pattern. So it's using the same pattern to achieve the opposite effect. So it's still functional in the same way. So the roots, if you like, are trying to express as much of a surface area and gather energy together, where the branches, if you like, are kind of doing the opposite, kind of reaching out in the other way. And then think about the journey of the water, which is gathered together on the tips of the roots, travels through the trunk of the tree, and then is dispersed out into the atmosphere, giving off humidity through all of that surface area of the trees. And then the opposite is happening is the tree is harvesting as much sun from the surface and channeling that together and sending that down to the roots, and then dispersing the sugars and things to as much surface area as the tree can to feed those microbes. So we've got a wonderful coming together and dispersal going in one direction, and then the coming together and dispersal happening in the other direction, layered through the same patterns. And again, just to see again, I think we can start to see now where these spongy, circular sort of elements are coming from, is when as these one root crosses over another, it sort of like closes off that root and leaves behind a little hole, which again has its own little habitat and whatever opportunities to it as well. So there's a lovely beech tree. I don't think we took that photo at Trevlock Farm, actually. I can't remember. Anyway, it was very old. I've been doing this talk for a long time. But yeah, lovely to see these patternings, branching patterns, to think how each one is an expression of a function or expression of kind of a physical reality. And there's something very important that we can take from those patterns. If you look at drainage and gully erosion and things, you see this pattern again and again and again. This pattern is created by the flow of water over sand. We've got these two different forces coming together. Sand has a set of sort of like physical properties of that, and the water is responding to gravity. This is just obviously on the seashore, and see again how these, what we would call little rills, these little featherings of the water coming over the surface from lots of different angles, but then finding a channel very quickly, and then that channel creating a direction. And if this was a big erosion feature on a mountainside, it could be very, very destructive. But what we're seeing is it's the way that sand particles are randomly arranged as the lapping of the water, and we get the same patterns. So again, you understand is we're just seeing the same physics again and again and again. It's action of water flowing over soil particles or mineral particles, giving us an identifiable pattern that we can put a name to. You can see how this repeats again, again, and again, in the same way we've seen within the river. So we're going to see that on the sand, on the shore. Okay, so there's thoughts about the first pattern archetype. Now this second one, this lobed pattern, we saw it in the dahlia. We saw it in a few of our examples, and we have been joined by Lydia. Good morning to you, Borodar, Lydia, and we're talking about patterns this morning, and we're talking about nature's patterns, those things that spontaneously form and somehow tell us something about the nature of reality. So the first one that we looked at was this branching pattern. You know, what we see in rivers, in river estuaries, or even our own venal system, arterial system, in trees, different kinds of trees, roots, even forming on the how water interacts with sand molecules, particles on a beach. That we're seeing a branching pattern that seems to perform a certain kind of function and tell us something about one of nature's pattern archetypes, of which we're going to describe 6 today. So number 2 is the lobed pattern. To me, that looks like a little cluster of eggs that you see sometimes on the side of a leaf on your brassicas. And each one of those eggs is a separate individual element, but by clustering them together, they have a degree of protection, maybe from being dried out or something like that. It also, the lobed pattern, looks like a cluster of penguins on the Arctic, doesn't it, on their ice cap, and the way that they cluster together to protect themselves, to give warmth. And they're always constantly shoveling around, aren't they? Shifting around, so that this poor penguin that's on the outside doesn't stay on the outside the whole time. It gets a chance to be in the middle, where it's warmer. So think about how the functions of that lobed pattern might work. How and when might you choose to use that in design? These are the cilia lining the gut, the digestive tract, and what we've got here is a very large amount of surface area. We've got these individual elements with gaps between them, where very unique conditions can form, and these maybe are bacterial communities or something like that living on them. So just interesting to think about how the body is, what the function of those might be, and what's going on. Next example we've got of this is skyscrapers. And in some strange way, each one of these represents an individual thing. There's a lobe and a repeating pattern again, and which we have created now enormous amounts of edge, surface area, and in this case, because they're hollow, we've got habitat inside on multiple layers. So we can stack together enormous quantities of materials or create an enormous amount of habitat. And again, in some ways, these gut cilia are trying to create habitat for microbes and for also different kinds of chemical exchanges to go on in the digestion process. And here we've got loads of maybe information exchanges or people exchanges stacked together in a big, intense, tense modern city. Let's go to a completely other extreme. Let's have a look at this wall, dry stone wall. As you cultivate a field, you find the rocks and move them to the edges, and then eventually have the opportunity to stack them together to create wind shelter, to create a barrier, field barrier, stock barrier, or a boundary to establish that. So you're building an edge out of your lobed thing. But also let's just think about how this wall, look, it's got so much moss on it, we can hardly see the wall. And that within each one, if you consider each one of these rocks is almost like a separate element, but they sit together to create this really amazingly functional thing that also has loads of cracks and spaces within it. Think how many shrews and voles, or how many little insects and things can find a refuge or something within that, inside it, on it, outside of it. So again, it's actually a very, very valuable thing, a lot of work, but stone walls are very, very valuable habitats. And there's an interesting element perhaps to bring into a garden or into a design space to fulfill a function of creating three-dimensional complex habitat. Lots of different little niches that might suit lots of different kinds of creatures, lots of different individuals. The edge of a kale plant. We could almost regard each one of these little sort of, what can we, convolutions as a little element of a lobe within a wider pattern, creating a lot of edge and surface area again. Look how it holds the water. Just interesting. So you may even recognize this. This is at Cultivate, where we were on Saturday. And I took this photo a few years ago now, in June or July or something. I know opposites of those, of the hugel beds. There's the one still covered, look. And I also thought about how, when given a free expression, this plant creates, replicates the lobed pattern. And then we've got individual elements all jostling together to try and catch and store, harvest as much of the solar energy that it can, and also think about how that might interact with water, flow water to the center of the leaf, down to the stem to feed the plant. So the plant is using a lobed pattern to explore a 3D environment of the air so that it may capture as much energy as possible, many interactions as possible. And to my eye, when I look at this, is the plants aren't shading each other out. So they're very strategically placed so that each one has the maximum opportunity to harvest as much solar energy as possible. So there we go. And there's another sort of just a really lovely, very healthy looking plants. This is why I got so excited about the hugel beds. Anyway, okay, lobed patterns. Here's an idea which we can bring into design. And here's something which is worth just unpacking a little bit as a thought. So let's think about gardens. What is a garden? A garden's a place where, okay, we grow plants, but actually a garden, well, what's the difference then between that and, I don't know, a forest or a field or something? Is a garden is a coming together of two elements, isn't it? It's of the plants and of the gardener. The garden and the gardener, the plants and the people. It's a coming together. So it's a very interesting edge, actually. Gardening is an edge effect between the human world and the plant world. And we already know, because we talked about it, is that we get more interactions at edges. There's more stuff going on because we kind of get the best of both worlds, or we get unique characteristics. So one thing is if I put my straight path through a garden, is where the path is and there aren't plants, is it lets a bit of light in. It's a bit more, obviously, because we've created a clear area. So if we're letting more light in, we might get more diversity of plants. There's opportunity for understory plants to form, and so forth. What else can we say about this? Is so if the function of the path, of course, as well, on one hand, it's an edge between the human world and the plant world. So we've got a very, very interesting interactions happening here and here, here and here. And as we journey through the garden, we're interacting with the bits closest to the path more, because I'm noticing it. Oh, look, there's a weed there. Oh, look, there's a strawberry there. I'm going to pick it. You know, on Sunday when we visited the Hoffman kiln, and we walked up a little staircase to get to the kiln, and on that wall there was loads of little wild strawberries, weren't there? Like little alpine strawberry plants hanging down on the wall, and we all spotted them and we ate them. And that's because they were growing right next to the path, so we interacted with it. Okay, Lydia's just struggling a bit with her Wi-Fi in the garden, but we'll hope it'll stick there. And again, we'll be posting this for you, Lydia. So we're thinking of you. The other thing that we can perhaps say about this path, though, is that to get from A to B, to get from this end of the garden to the other end of the garden, it gets us there most efficiently. Straight line, obviously, is the definition of a straight line. It's the shortest distance between 2 points. So if I'm carrying a load of paving slabs or a whole big bag of muck, I want to go in a straight line. So there's also the path has another function of just direction. So we've got interactions with the garden and we've got direction. Okay. In our second path, we might say, okay, let's expand the interactions within the garden. Let's try and make it so that we're picking more alpine strawberries. You know, there's more interactions. So if I make a curved path, let's say this path has a length of 7, and this path might have a length of 10 or 12, because it's no longer doing the straight line effect. but it's creating edges. It's actually allowing us to interact with our garden more without having to stand on the soil, which we've already said is something we don't want to do. So here we've got now, this is going to create a more productive garden because we're going to spot more alpine strawberries. We're going to pick more weeds or whatever. We're going to notice a hole in the mulch and fix it. And especially if we're journeying through this place regularly, we'll make those observations. We also get a little bit annoyed because it's a bit wiggly. We've got a long way. So back to our lobes. That same that pattern effect is, okay, so we could bring these two ideas together perhaps and create a sort of a hyper design idea. And so now let's go back to, let's have our straight line, because we're carrying heavy slabs from one end of the garden to the other. But then let's create keyholes. Let's explore now how I can create a short path. Maybe I'm standing here, and when I'm standing here and we've placed these elements 1.2 meters apart, like we discussed, I can garden, I can reach all around, and I don't have to stand on the soil. Then I can come here, I can do the same, and then from here I can reach to the part that I couldn't reach from here. So we've created, maximize the edge whilst maintaining our straight line distance. It's a design choice. You can still curve this line, you can make this line, obviously this is just kind of an idea, but we're showing how design can work in this. We're thinking about the functions of each design and how maximizing edge can create more interactions, but maybe also can make for a more circuitous journey. Here's a very simple expression of the keyhole path idea. Obviously, maybe a slightly naive version. I need to get some better pictures. But we've got some lovely, these are ideas that we gave to the refugees as well, and they did amazing things with this. Because then this also leads us to the idea of a mandala pattern, of a repeating pattern. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Oh, here we go. So as I say, we don't necessarily have to make it straight. It doesn't necessarily have to look like these archetypes. But we can take the function of that pattern and apply it. So here's our very simple keyhole bed. The gardener can walk in, stand here, reach all around, and then walk around the outside. So if we're happy with one keyhole bed, and we're happy with the functionality of that, is we might then want to repeat it. So the idea then of a pattern that endlessly repeats itself, or repeats itself many times, it brings us to the mandala. And this is an archetype pattern for a mandala garden, in which we again exploring the idea of edge and interactions. If we want a highly productive garden, we want to be able to get the most out of it, then we need a lot of edge and a lot of interactions. And if we're happy just to stick a few roses in and go and prune them once a year, then we don't need to go to all of this trouble. But so it's about maximizing the interactions to fulfill an intended function. So this is the way that we do it in design, and approach design in permaculture, is we're not just saying, oh, but Steve said we have to have mandala patterns. No, I didn't say that. What I said was, if we want to maximize that effect, then that's the approach that we would use to do that. But it's always about designing to fulfill intended function. What's the outcome you want to achieve? And we always know that to increase productivity and to increase diversity, we want to maximize edges. So there's our thought on that. Interesting to look at these very simple patterns, repeating patterns. We could think about as a lobed pattern as well. Maybe these are trees in a forest. Each one of these green circles is a tree in a forest. And look how we, in this block, because we put them all in nice straight lines, nice and tidy, we can get 70 plants into the area. And we've also created an ability for airflow to go straight through the system, which may or may not be our intention. If we offset everything so that this one sort of sat right there, or that one, the sat in we're using the spaces in between the elements more deliberately and more carefully, then we can get 86 trees into the same space. And also we've now created a much longer, more complex journey for airflows to make through the wood. So that wood then is going to be much more resistant to wind. There's much more friction, so the trees will absorb some of the energy in the wood, in the wind, slow it all down. Which is the correct one to use? It depends on the function you want to achieve. Key point. Okay, so this is the eye of a fly. And again, we could think of each one of these things perhaps as a separate element, but as performing together as a whole. And what we've got is a curved surface, and we've got sixes. This looks kind of like a flat surface here because we've got lots of regular hexagons. And then as we go around the corner, look how the shape of them distorts slightly. So this one here is a totally textbook Euclidean geometry, sort of perfect hexagon. Look at that, equal sides, everyone equidistant. As you go over the curve of the eye, it changes the form ever so slightly, so that now we can go around a corner. So look, these arms of the hexagon are shorter. This one is almost a 5. So again, see how nature varies patterns ever so slightly, or the proportions of it, to create a different effect. This is very, very interesting and important mathematically. It's something that Buckminster Fuller and other people have brought into architecture, trying to think about shapes and structures and strength whilst using the minimum amount of materials, which becomes a very important thought. Okay, so there's our lobed pattern. There's a lot to think about in that one. Next one is fascinating, and this is one of the really great insights that we get into the way that the universe works when we look at patterns. And this relates to principle 9 in permaculture, small and slow solutions, which I think is the one that gives us a massive insight into how we can affect change. This is the mathematics of the universe expressed to us. And it's a very simple mathematical formula, like the branching pattern. And it's that if we begin with 0, and with 0 and 1, if we were to add 1 to 0, the sum of that is 1. If we add 1 and 1, the sum of that is 2. If we add 2 and 1, the sum of that is 3. 3 and 5 makes 8. 8 and 5 makes 13. 13 and 8 makes 21. 21 and 13 makes 34. These are Fibonacci numbers. This is a Fibonacci series described by, I guess he was a mathematician, Dave Fibonacci. I don't know what his name was. We should look him up. Anyway, interesting. But the point is, this series, this pattern language appears everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. And we'll have some fun exploring that a little bit as well. So the Fibonacci gives you the spiral. It gives you the nautilus shell. It gives you the chameleon's tail. It gives you the sundew leaf. It gives you that that form that can wrap around itself, but also can accelerate very, very quickly into growth. If we do it on squared paper, do a bit of maths. 1 plus 1 is 2. 2 plus 3 is 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. And if you draw a line, cross those, bisecting each one of those squares, go around like that, like that. Well, it goes like that, doesn't it? So it goes that way. So we end up with an accelerating spiral. Look how quickly it goes from very small. It's already opening up and becoming quite big. And here we see it in the nautilus shell, which is a kind of a water-borne snail. And here's a cross-section through its shell. And what we're seeing is these little chambers, I guess, so that the shell can float a bit. But what's interesting is to think about is that as the snail grows, so does the shell. And the shell's only attached to the actual snail just here on a sort of on its, I don't know what it would be, on its sort of back, onto the back of its body, and there's new material forming there all the time. So the shell, as the snail grows, the shell rotates. And the key point is the shell is functional at every size. So when the snail is really small, and the snail is small, the shell is perfectly proportionate to the snail. And as the snail grows, so does the shell. So it's always providing the function that the snail needs at any time. And the very important observation that we can make and we can think about is that that idea about sort of incremental growth, and slowly something can grow from quite small to very big, but be functional at every proportion. And I kind of think, and I'll enlarge on this later on the course, but this is kind of the metaphor for change, for growth. Incremental. We need food every day. We need, whatever it is, the things that sustain us every day, but or whatever it is that we're trying to do to develop or build something, is it needs to be, if we can make it function at a small scale and then we grow it slowly, then we can increase that functionality and express it at different scales. And as it's happening slowly, we can then react and respond to whatever changes are happening and work with it. So it's something which we can allow to grow through incremental growth, little stage by stage. And look, we can see the increments within the snail shell there of each iteration of the shell as it grows, and how it remains functional throughout that process. Back to our lovely broccoli, and again is these patterns and spirals conform to the Fibonacci series. And when we look into the Secret Life of Chaos video, which was going to be your main viewing thing this evening, we'll get an exploration of these ideas a little bit further, a little bit more deeply, and I think you're going to really enjoy that. But look how each one of these patterns is spiraling around the same form of what we're describing, but then each element itself is going off and repeating and repeating and repeating. So again, think about that. Think about how the formula for permaculture is really quite simple. 3 ethics, 12 principles, and a bunch of design tools. We take those very, very simple ideas and we allow them to express themselves, if you like, in the natural world. And what we get is repeating patterns. We get uniqueness. Every project, every design is unique, but we're all actually being unique and responding to exactly the same external stimuli. So we create recognizable patterns. And any one of these shapes is the product of a series of lots of little things that have happened before to make that come about. So again, for me, there's a massive metaphor within this for how we create change in the world, and how our individual change mirrors the same journey that other people are on, and that when those things cluster together, you then get very, very significant change. I think that's one of my key ideas I want you to take into this. There we go. That's the Andromeda galaxy that we're looking at, and look how we've got a spiral with different arms on it. There's one going this way, there's one going this way, and these patterns conform to Fibonacci. So even when we're looking high up into the universe, we see the same things. So this takes us back to this idea of the fractals, the same pattern at different scales. So if we can understand things at one scale, we can then allow that to multiply out and create very, very significant change and very significant effects. And that's what we are all about. So think about permaculture perhaps as a global movement or a global expression of pattern language, we might start to get an insight of how much and how quickly we can amplify change globally by conforming to the same pattern language. So this is the learning that we're trying to get out. I think that's at the heart of it. It's such a key idea. So looking to the universe. Here's our bracken. Again, a bit like an unfurling of a leaf. You can think how it is as it's starting to come out of its protective case. It's ready now to grow and express itself, and it's going to unroll. So that same curling and uncurling process. Oh, it's Fibonacci. It's the Nautilus shell, where we are absolutely again at the same pattern, fulfilling a different function. So there's me illustrating that with my hand, where actually, if you measure the length of the phalanges, the bones in your hand, they also proportionately fit together to conform to Fibonacci. And in fact, even your arms, the bones in your arms actually do as well. And that's again is because we're created by the same physics. We're all responding to the same thing. So we can take all of these things, this universality of this Fibonacci this spiral shape, very, very interesting. It's also interesting to think now this is Gaudi in Barcelona, in Catalonia. This is architecture, this is art. We can take these ideas and we can express this form within art because it's something pleasing about it. There's something aesthetically harmonious about it. And then it edges us towards this concept of the golden ratio. That's, whoever, again, I don't know where that term comes from, but somebody described this Fibonacci spiral, this relationship, this numeric relationship as the golden ratio, something that's functional, aesthetically pleasing, and successional about it, and so therefore let's work with that. Okay, this is a permaculture cliche, but actually one that it's not my favorite ever herb spiral, and just a photo I happen to have kicking around. But let's think about it anyway. This spiral has a three-dimensional form to it, actually a little bit like the Romanesque broccoli. We've got a high point in the middle, and it goes down to a low point down here. These stones arranged in it, if you like, again, describing that spiral shape. And you can imagine perhaps if water or nutrients might cascade down on a rainy day, might cascade down in a spiral form to a certain degree, nourishing the whole environment and making the water do the longest possible journey so that it comes into contact with as many roots as possible. So there's our first consideration. The second is, of course, because it's high at the top and low at the bottom, and water will go downhill as it responds to gravity, is this bit is going to be drier than this bit. This will be wet. The wettest bit will be down the bottom, and the driest bit will be at the top. So we're creating microclimate. We're creating a gradation, a sort of a series from the driest part to the wettest part. And then, so somewhere on that continuum will be the right conditions for several different kinds of plants, the ones that favor particular conditions. We've also got a north, south, east, west to it. So we can think about the solar angle and the solar gain, according to if we're in the northern hemisphere, the sun rises in the east, travels around the south, and sets somewhere over in the west. So therefore, you could say this front side of the spiral is going to be the sunnier sector. It's going to receive more energy, and at the back, what we seem to have big tall plants. You've got onions and chives and things like that, which stand up much higher, so they can also receive the sun that shines over the top of the herb spiral. If we all had all the big tall plants on the front side, they'd shade out the rest of it. So again, we've got strategic placement of elements in a system so that we can harvest the solar flow as most efficiently as we can to create yields which fulfill needs or functions. So this is a very simple expression of a permaculture design process. It's been thought about deliberately. Now you could look at some of those species and say, but are they in the right place? And maybe the thyme should be there and the whatever oregano should be over there. Well, observe and interact. That's how we learn, is we play. If we can create differences, we notice what the differences are, and then we try moving some of those elements around, we learn. So we can also think about design by increments as well. So we can try out one bit, see if it works, and try out another, and slowly allow the picture to form. Small and slow solutions. Yeah, okay, so here we are with our patterns. I've just been chatting with some of our Ugandan friends and colleagues. Lydia's off. She says bye to everyone, and yeah, it's going to be a nice day. I think a bit overcast anyway. She's hoping to enjoy the weather. This is Nero rock paintings. I was a bit smarter. I had photos on my Facebook feed today of people there at the rock paintings. This is very close to where we just ran our PDC in Uganda. And this rock painting, this is a representation of the rock painting, not the actual thing, but a copy of it, is, I don't know, thousands of years old, 2,000-3,000 years old, something like that. Painted by the Twa people who would have lived in eastern Uganda and now largely live in western Uganda going into Congo. So they've been kind of displaced slightly. And it's a pattern. It's placed on the underside of a boulder, and to actually see it, you've got to sort of go in on your back almost and look up to see it. There's other sort of important pieces of rock art in this same location. So it's obviously a very important part, and whoever it was who designed and painted this emblem, this symbol, was trying to communicate something. Who knows what and to whom. But whatever it was obviously significant or important, and maybe it was just an establishment of an idea within those people. But what's interesting is it's traveled through time, 2,000-3,000 years, and now here we are looking at it, wondering what it might mean. So that's something very, very interesting. And it's expressed as a pattern, as a complex pattern. So again, there's also that encourages us to interpret it and to use our own pattern language to make sense of it in a way in which if we just saw a foreign language written down, we probably wouldn't, or especially a script that we weren't familiar with, ancient Greek or Hindi or something. I don't know, we can't, or ancient Twa language, however these guys communicated. What does it mean? I don't know, but when I look at it, it means a lot to me. So whether it's the same thing that there's the designer is a separate question, but is further on today in our pattern language, when we start looking into design, we'll consider zones and sectors. And in permaculture, there's 5 zones: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we've got 5 zones, and we have ourself in the middle, which we call zone 0. So there's you observing the world, home, community, work, the periphery, the outside, and then actually wilderness, nature. So say this is me imposing my meaning and interpretation on someone else's design. I don't know what it's Michelle, greetings to you. Borada, good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, I hope you got home safe. I didn't have too far to go yesterday, did you? So
no, it's fine.
Great, nice to be back. So we've been thinking about patterns. We've
Uh-huh.
recorded this and I'll be posting it. And what we're saying is that when we look at nature's patterns, they themselves form into patterns. And these patterns form archetypes. There's 6 of them, and we can identify them again and again and again. And at the moment we're talking about spirals and repeating patterns. And we're just looking at this section piece of cave art, possibly 3,000 years old, from eastern Uganda. And I was just sort of saying how, to me, to my permaculture mind anyway, so if I pose my interpretation on it, it makes me think about me as an individual and how I relate to the different spheres of, you know, home and family and community and the people I work with and my acquaintances and the sort of natural world that exists beyond that, the sort of world that I'm navigating. Here I am as an individual within these layers. What are these things? When you go around, you do the guided tour, they tell you that these certain things represent, I don't know, boats and ladders and certain sort of things. But to me, when I looked at it, it looks like the male and female principle, male and female patterns. That looks like fallopian tubes or a penis and a vagina or something. But is just something maybe about the equal and opposite forces of creation, that those forces of nature that come together to then create the reality that contains us and community and society. I could be totally wrong, but that's the beauty of interpreting patterns, is it's open to you, isn't it? So I think that's really beautiful, and I think it's really interesting, and I'll find some proper photos of it maybe for you later, because it's a really, really lovely place. Anyway, there we go. Next. Our next pattern archetype. So that was within the spiral, Michelle. And our next one is the net. Now, we started off by saying this principle, the design from patterns to detail is typified. The icon is the spider's web. I said that each spider's web is completely unique because it's an expression of that moment in time and the anchor points and the spider itself. And you can see, look at it, how there's been a lot of attention to detail in this middle bit. And then I don't know what happened here, and then I know off again. So the web is obviously designed to use a very minimal amount of material. It's very, very thin gossamer strands that the spider can produce. I mean, it's extraordinary. There's a thing about 8-legged creatures. You do know that they're not sure that they come from the same origin as us. So things like octopi and spiders, they're pretty wild and wacky things. And most things either have, 2, 4, or 6 legs. 8 is pretty nuts. But anyway, I don't know. Spiders, I think, are way more interesting than we realize. Anyway, and you've ever thought that your spiders in your house think of you as your house as a housemate? They're part of that guild of species that regulating environment in your house. Anyway, interesting. So the point being here, though, that even though every web is unique, you see that and you go, aha, it's a spider's web, because you're recognizing the pattern. Functional considerations of this pattern are, it's trying to cover as much surface area because we want to catch things, we want to catch flies. If there was a fishing net, we want to catch fish. So we're trying to explore air, we're trying to explore surface area for the purposes of sieving out certain things. So again, is the size of the spacings of the strands of the web reflect the intended target species of insect. Obviously the smaller the thing that the spider's trying to catch, the finer the web has to be, and therefore the more work it has to do. So form follows function. This web looks like this because the spider has a strategy in mind. It's trying to catch a certain size thing. It's on a certain sort of flight path or something like that. And yeah, so that's its chosen design to fulfill the function of its catching its food. So again, spider doesn't really care what it looks like, what the web looks like. What matters is it going to catch it some flies for breakfast? Here's us building the lovely roundhouse that we all sat in only on Sunday. There's Dave Chestermaster, look, and there's Dave Thomas, and that's April. She's a hairdresser from Clansan Fried. Building the structure, spiders and flies, that maybe it's not the same link, but we built this structure within the first community garden because they told us that they'd found it very hard to get volunteers, and when volunteers come, especially when there wasn't much going on in the garden, they just came and picked weeds, and it wasn't very fulfilling. So we thought, well, let's start off with something that is more fulfilling and has a greater sense of accomplishment and involvement. We built the first version of our roundhouse. It turns out lots of people want to do low impact building. There's the support strut I mentioned. So when you make your reciprocal frame roof, every beam is sitting on the previous one. So as you build it, you've got to hold the first beam until they're all in place, and then you can, when you've gone around the whole circle, everything's sitting on the one before, you can kick out the support structure. So there's me just about to do that. And when we looked up at it, we realized, it was only really then, we realized, oh, look, we've recreated that same sort of spider's net pattern. We've tried to create something that has an enormous amount of strength so that we don't want our roof to fall down, and we didn't want to have support structures sort of crowding up the internal space. It creates a lovely open space. It gives you the maximum strength for the minimum materials to perform that function. So therefore it struck me, well, it's no surprise, is it, that we've replicated the same pattern. So is that a web? I don't know. It kind of is, isn't it? Just seeing how water catches on the surface, how light catches on the surface of water. This pattern is mycelium. And what we've got going on here is really fascinating. So this is 100 microns is the scale. That's 100 microns. That's 100 thousandth of a millimeter or something. That's this is very small, in other words. Look how some of these mycelial pathways go in a straight line, a bit like our garden path, directly from A to B. Others are doing more circuitous routes, and they're interacting with more of the elements around them. Some of them are clustering together to create kind of almost motorways and highways, and some are just individual strands. So we've got, and we might even think that each one of those hyphae, those little mycelial tubes, might actually be responding to slightly different need or function within the environment that it's operating in. That's really interesting, again, to think about, because the mycelium itself is deciding how to deploy its resources, or not deciding, but it's responding to the surrounding environment, which basically creates the same effect. Interesting. In some ways, we may or may not understand what's going on in this, but in some ways, this represents a flow of information, because, as I said, the mycelium itself is responding to whatever it is it's responding to. It's responding to signals from its environment. And so often, where the mycelium finds something that it's interested in, it will subdivide and subdivide, create a lot of surface area so it can digest it. Where it doesn't find anything interesting, it hurries through to get to the next place as quickly as possible. So if it's interesting, it subdivides and creates complexity. If it's not, it carries on through in a straight line. So that represents in some way information. It's something that it's interacting with its living environment. So it's interesting then to consider the computer system. There's a block of information, something I'm really interested in, and then this is linking that to that, and that one to that one, and this one to this one, or the same kind of way that's going on here. They might not be exactly the same, but in some ways, the similar patterns are replicating because it's an expression in some way of the same function. Form follows function. This is like I don't know, but linking together a bunch of computer servers. Here are lots of different servers linked together through a system. And again, is each time we get these sort of mycelial patterns. So mycelium represents information in some ways. This could be a pattern of intelligence. This might actually be what intelligence looks like expressed in a pattern. As I said earlier, is that the web, the spider's web, is almost an extension of its own mind, they're thinking. That's an expression of its thoughts. That's how, if you like, again, it represents its thinking, its desire to catch certain things, and how it's responding to the natural world that it's in. So these repeating patterns in some way follow that same thing. This is a bit pixelated. I need to find a better pattern picture than this, but this represents the internet. And again is different connecting lines and hubs and nodes of crossing multiplied up like a really big area. So again, we're seeing that universality of pattern types is a thing. This is an ecosystem, and often we do this as an activity, actually, and it's a fun thing to do, and we haven't done it because we're not in the same physical place. So I need to think about how to replicate this activity as an online thing. But imagine that this is a pond. This is a food web of Little Rock Lake. And each one of these things represents a species. There is a smallmouth bass or a leech. Right down here on our first trophic level, we've got phytoplankton. So the energy coming into the system is plants trapping the sun's energy, and then there's going to be lots of zooplankton that eat the plant plankton. So there's a relationship between the first trophic level and the second trophic level, and that one is regulating the population of the other, and the energy that was translated through the phytoplankton is now expressed in the zooplankton. And zooplankton then obviously become the source of the food for the next layer of the food chain. But maybe also is this zooplankton is interacting with this zooplankton in a certain way, exchanging nutrients and minerals and information. And so there are relationships in between each level, as well as then we go up the trophic levels. So, and these nodes of crossing of all these different energy interactions are the individuals within the ecosystem, or the different species within the ecosystem. So if we map all of those relationships, we get a web. And what we notice that when we do it physically, if we do that with a ball of wool, and I say, okay, Michelle, you're a stickleback, and Sean, you're an owl, and I'm a fern, and Lindsay's whatever, a frog or something. We can then explore the relationship. Well, the tree creates the habitat for the frog. The frog regulates in some ways the pests that maybe eat the leaves on the tree by eating eggs and stuff like that. So there's a relationship between the tree and the frog and the tree, and the more of those relationships that you have, and the more elements you have in your system, more different species. What you notice is as you map those connections with the ball of wool, so if I pass the ball of wool to you, Michelle, to represent the relationship between the owl and the vole, or whatever it is I said you were, then if we keep doing that, what we notice is the strands of the web get stronger and stronger the more we interact. So there's something within that helps us understand the notion of what is resilience. What makes an ecosystem strong and efficient? And it's two things, or it's the interaction of two things. One is, if there's lots of different elements in that system, then there's more possibility for more interactions. And the more interactions there are, the stronger the system becomes, because now there's like a redundancy principle of, if we were to lose one of those elements, the system could carry on. But at what point does the system break down when we lose, if we lose one of these species, or one of these species, or one of these species, at what rate does that break down? And inversely, that maybe some of these higher species might act in a way in which they energize the whole system. There might be a keystone species. I mentioned about keystone species in the books, and I think I might show you a short video actually to think of expand on that. That might be a good thing to start off after our break with, which is in 8 minutes. You'll be interested to hear. Okay, so there we go. There's our we're exploring webs. We're realizing that webs represent a very efficient deployment of materials, that they represent thought and intelligent networks and information in some way because of these multiple connections, and that these webs mirror our information systems and the internet, and also with the relationships within an ecosystem. I think all of that is very, very interesting, and we need to take this understanding quite deeply on board. Here's another mycelial pattern. I was making some raised beds, and we had a pile of larch boards that had been cut and been delivered from the timber mill. And I don't know how long they'd sat there, but after a little while, and some moisture had formed between the boards. And when I pulled them apart, I saw this absolutely wonderful mycelial pattern. And again, we're seeing the same processes, same things that we've seen in the other examples. There's a bit where I put my finger. Look, I squidged it as I was pulling them apart. I didn't quite realize what I was looking at. So I messed it up a little bit there. What we're seeing is, look, there's a point there. Whatever it is that the mycelium was exploring and looking for, it found it here, because it's created so many subdivisions that it's created a huge blob. That's like London City or something in the equivalent. So it's complexity. You've got another one there, another one there, another one there. There's little ones that over there. There's another very strong one there. So we call these nodes of crossing. And obviously, lots of different mycelial strands crossing over each other, we start getting a real intensity of connections. Now, also, that happens when the mycelium is going to get ready to fruit or flower. As the mycelium clusters together and then creates a structure which may look like a mushroom or a cap or some other kind of structure, but basically it's a coming together. There's mycelium to be able to then create spores for replication. Other threads of this mycelium, look, are hurrying across the system. We've got almost motorways in places where it's sort of traveling a long distance. And here, it's almost like a snowfield. There's a lot of subdivision there again. So let's go back to that little stat that I gave you for Paul Stamets when he talked about 8 miles of mycelium in a cubic inch of soil. So about an inch by an inch, 8 miles. Okay, now you get it. If you didn't before, you can see now. This is how complex nature is. Look, if you want scale, there's a woodlouse. So this is hugely complex, massively complex system. But in some ways, this represents relationships, represents desire lines. It represents exchange of nutrients and information. There may be hormones, there may be antibodies, there might be water and nutrients flowing across this through this complex webbed creature. It's a living thing. Hello, ancestor. Weaving creates the same kind of, again, perhaps for the same reason as the roof of the building does. We want strength and we want to use minimal materials. And again, we designed for function, form follows function. Scatter pattern. This is how nature plants seeds, blows them on the wind. Nature saturates itself with seeds. It makes sure it gets a positive outcome by trial and error, by creating many starting points. And then from those many starting points, one of those seeds is going to find the optimum conditions. It's kind of almost inevitable. Saturate a system with seeds and just stand back and let it happen. That's nature's way of ensuring it gets the right outcome. If you read Jeff Hamilton's gardening book, or any gardening book, just like name check Jeff Hamilton. He does some really, really great books on gardening, or he did till he died. But if you read those gardening books, it'll say space things out the optimum distance, and that's our trial and error of learning how, if you like, to form follows function, learning how to achieve a particular outcome. But we've learned that by trying out every other permutation. You know, what happens when we put them a bit closer together? What happens when we put 3 seeds in one, or, you know, whatever, 20? Because nature does that. Nature tries it all out, and it guarantees a result to a degree. So this is interesting. So imagine you're farming. Imagine you are a subsistence farmer, hand to mouth. That money, that rupee that you spent on those seeds is your only rupee. You want a result. And you're hungry today, you're hungry tomorrow, and you're hungry next week. So we want short-term, medium-term, and long-term yields from our system. How might we do that? How might we guarantee we get a result? Because this is so important. This is about our survival. And in the process, we actually do it in which we get, short-term, medium-term outcomes. And perhaps we learn as well, because, hey, this is permaculture. It's about observing and interacting. So we make a lovely seed bed. We hoe it, and we get a nice fine tilth ready to receive seeds. It's nice and moist. Look, we've added some compost. So here's a good way to do it: is to create a germination bed, water it, create perfect conditions, and go away for a few days. Come back and observe, and wait for the tiny little weed seedlings, those seeds that were there already. Scatter pattern in short nature's insurance system to make sure we don't get bare soil. Remember, those weeds, those fast carbon pathways are there to cover the soil, to protect it from the sun. So the first flush of things that might germinate will be the seeds that you disturbed when you made the seed bed. So those weed seeds are now ready, starting to come up and do their job. So then you come along with your hoe, maybe your French hoe with a little operating with a thing on the end like that, and we hoe it very, very, very gently. So the seeds are tiny, remember, and when a seed first germinates, it's using the energy stored in the seeds to create the shoot. So until it gets the first true leaf, it's not photosynthesizing, so it's very, very vulnerable, and it's using its energy, its only one-off store of energy, to create that first true leaf. So you come along with your hoe and you wait till it's just on that point, just before the weed seedling, just before it starts photosynthesizing, when it's still very, very small, and you just disturb the roots a little bit with your hoe. You don't turn over the soil, because then you'll create more seeds to germinate. But if you just go through the surface and you disrupt those seeds, those weeds, they'll die because they've used up their energy. So now you've got a seed-free seed bed to sow in, and then you can scatter. You could do, this is what Sepp Holzer does, and over vast acres of ground. He's learned to do is he has the target plants he wants to grow, and he literally just mixes them all up together and peppers the ground with it. So whether they are the vegetables he wants, the wildflowers he's growing around it, the bee pollinator plants, the weeds, other things, he just mixes them all up and scatters the ground. Okay, let's go back to the example I gave you, though, where we want to be more precise and we're more focused on getting the right yields because maybe we're in a survival situation. So we've now mixed our seeds up and we've peppered the ground with them. So what we know is that anything that's coming up, we put it there. It's all food. And what we've got in our variety of our population of seeds that we've added are, we've got some carrots, we've got some lettuces, we've got some radishes, we've got some fenugreek, we've got some mustard, we've got some brassicas, we might have some onions. And what we know about all of those plants is they all kind of germinate at a different rate. So some things, the things that grow really, really fast, like let's say the mustard, the fenugreek seed, maybe some coriander, those things come very, very quickly, is you're kind of using those as ground cover. And their function of those plants is to cover the ground quickly and start circulating sugars in the soil, so that these slower growing things like the brassicas and the whatevers can also then get to go. So we're creating a polyculture of plants. And then even from a few days into this system, I can come along almost with my tweezers and I can start selecting out the plants that I want to reinforce the ones. So I'm looking at this again, which ones do I want to let grow and become fully mature? Which ones are actually too close together? And I can pull those out. I'm doing weeding, but the weeds I'm pulling out were all things that I planted. So I start eating the mustard and the fenugreek and the cress and the fast growing plants. Straight away, my ground cover, the basic establishment plants also then become the first thing I eat from the system. And then as I'm continually, this is called a poly-veg bed or poly-veg system, poly as in many. And the idea of this is you interact with it continuously. So this is a bed that you have very close to your house and you pick it almost every day. So if you're a subsistence farmer and this is a key part of your nutrition, you'll pay it a lot of attention. And then as the garden develops, you basically eat the fastest growing plants first, and then the slower ones next, and then you leave to maturity the long-term yield, say things like the kale or the cabbage or something, which take longer to grow and establish. So we've got a time stacking within this, and we've used the scatter patterning to allow nature to just, some of these seeds will arrive in the right optimum conditions, others will be far too close together or whatever. But as we interact, we fine tune that, and we hone it, and we allow then expression, and we get an almost perfect garden from it. Scatter pattern, random assembly. It's a genuinely, it's as much as a genuine approach to design as anything else. It's just random assembly. This is what nature does. So the scatter pattern is a reflection of random assembly. So here we go, wave pattern. Wave represents energy, really, in many ways. Think about how water flows and how the wave, actually, this is an interesting diagram because the surface of the water is much more energized, going over rocks, blown by the wind. Then we've got the genuine flow, the deeper flow energy, which is less energetic. And then we've got our base flow, which again is more directional. Interesting. Expressions of waves in art and in culture and design. You realize that these are very, very important forms. Clouds, waves of obviously water, very much expression in water. Regular waves, choppy waves, energetic waves. And we're seeing the flow shape in water when this is obviously a time-lapse, open, long exposure of water. And then we get that sense of the flow of waves as well. It's not just the turbulence, there's a directional flow to it. There's somebody weaving with a peg loom. Again, there's a flow to that form as well. It struck me as something within weaving that is similar or reminiscent. Again, back to water, waves on the surface of the water, there's ripple effect. But important, this is why I think, again, is that when we think of the wave as a form, as it represents an energy flow, and this is what electricity looks like. And actually we have, I guess it's a positive and negative current. The energy flows as a wave. It's a sine wave of mains power. That's what it looks like as a shape. That's what the flow of energy in your heart and obviously the blood distributed around your body. It is a wave pattern. That's the electrical signal within your heart, represents the atrium, ventricle, atrium complex movement, which we get from this. The blood passes from the heart to your lungs. It's energized, comes back to the heart, and then it's pumped all the way around the body. Very, very important, obviously. Okay, so there's our 6 basic patterns. That's it. That's the ones that we see commonly everywhere. And oh, I've gone 6 minutes over time. Sorry about that. It's going to add a few more things. Is if we then go to this sort of geometry, here's a regular perfect sphere built out of pentagons and hexagons. So we saw this earlier on in the first patterns, and then you can think about how you could bring this into architecture. So the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, again, where you've got basalt cooling slowly, and you're getting hexagons, same patterns. Oh look, that's a pentagon, but yes, same patterns. Snowflakes, always 6, always a hexagon, but always different, because everyone is responding to the uniqueness of that drop of water and that bit of time and the forces. So in the same way as every fingerprint is different, every leaf is different, every spider's web is different, the way that water reacts when it freezes is unique, but it's always a 6. So there's something about the intrinsic form of water which always forms a 6. Brambles in 3s, nettles in pairs, 2s or 4s, apples in 5s. What this means, we know not, maybe, but it's just always, it's very, very interesting to consider. But plus we've got these structures within the apple, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Interesting, 5s and 10s in an apple. These are different 3D shapes. It's a 4D shape. Hard to imagine. We can understand a 3-dimensional shape a little bit better. This is notional, conceptual. This is by this understanding, we can now create structures which have the minimum amount of material, but they create the maximum strength because we're copying it from nature. These are pattern archetypes. So when we saw the eye of the fly, we could see how the proportions of 5s and 6s and the lengths of each hexagon, whether it's regular or irregular, allow us to create curves and other complex shapes, again, with a maximum integrity, minimum structural materials. This is the British Museum, where they're connecting a straight surface to a circular surface. Really interesting. They're using the same kind of mathematical processes. So there's some kind of universality behind the mathematics of form. And again, that's what we'll be exploring later. As a seawall, so I said to make it strong, and if you want it flat, you can just have hexagons, and hexagons are really strong because everyone's touching the others in as many places as possible. So that's for sea defense. It's again in art, it's in movement. Patterns are pleasing to the eye. There's something interesting about it. There is the repeating hexagons again to create the strength of a chicken wire fence. So again, as we're covering a bit like with the web, we're covering the maximum surface with a minimum material, but we're using the hexagon shape to get the strength so that we can keep those damn chickens out. And then there's another pattern on top of it. There's a fan-trained espalier apple tree or fruit tree. Again, more art. And then final observations, so we will have our tea break a bit late, sorry. Final observations is back to the mycelium, is if this first pattern here, let's say it's something like a caterpillar or, you know, whatever, is these are the command and control centers. These are the important hubs. This is the backbone. This is the neurological system. This is the decision-making system for a hierarchical organism or hierarchical structure. You know, and this is the command and control. These are the different elements out exploring the environment. So if we lose one of these legs, whatever this is represents, the caterpillar can carry on, the millipede can carry on functioning. But if we break something in between these command and control centers, the neurological parts, the information-based parts, is the whole structure fails. You break your back, you're in all sorts of trouble, your feet don't work anymore. You break your vertebrae and your arms stop working. So it's something that this pattern has a function, but it also has inherent weaknesses to it. This is the diffuse pattern or the dispersed pattern. This is the pattern of mycelium. And maybe this is the pattern of as a political system, this also represents something that's autonomous and much, much stronger and more adaptable. So if we lose any of these arms, any of this connection between here and here, is look, there's another way around. we can reroute it and go it a different way. Even if we lose one of these command and control centers, one of these nodes is knocked out, there's other ways to go around. So this is the pattern of a hierarchical decision-making system. This is a pattern of Extinction Rebellion, or a leaderless organization. And actually, we can have layers to this as well. It starts to look a bit like a transistor, or something, a computer chip, because we can have multiple layers of complexity and alternative different routes. And then we can have a sort of an overview of a slightly simpler, and then here's our top layer. So if we go back to the mycelial pattern, is that top layer might represent a really fast straight pathway from A to B, whereas the lower layers represent the layering where we've got lots of individual complexity, many more interactions going on. So look, this diffuse pattern represents resilience. It represents something that has a much more dynamic ability to resist adversity and to create new options. But this one is much more cumbersome and much more vulnerable. So there's another lovely, mycelium on a sunny day digesting wood. You can just look at the absolute total complexity, but also functionality of that design. And what the mycelium is actually doing is it's exuding enzymes. Mycelium do extracellular digestion. They eat their food outside of their body. They squirt enzymes, ooze enzymes. They surround the food. They drip enzymes onto that food, in this case wood chip. It digests. You can see it's becoming almost like liquid, and then the mycelium can absorb it. So the more surface area we have, the more we can catch and absorb that digested wood, and then with that we can build more mycelium. Fascinating. Okay, guys, sorry for running over. I have done that by 30 minutes. We will reconvene at 11. So we've got a just 16, 17-minute break. And come back with some thoughts. I'll pause now, though, because we've gone a bit over time. See you at 11. Zoom recording. Yeah, so on YouTube, there's a wonderful series called, a little channel called Number File, in which you get kind of geeky maths people unpacking some of these ideas a lot deeper than perhaps we can go through on a PDC, but it's fun to look at, and I do enjoy some of those, especially fractals and the Mandelbrot set and that. Here's a fun, short, it's got a children's, so 6 minutes, sort of aimed more at kids, but I like it because it's fun. And this is called Doodling in Maths, Spirals and Fibonacci. There's a series. I'm just going to show you the first part of that series. And again, if you're interested, you can find these and watch them yourself.
Say your name, you're in math class and your teacher's talking about, well, who knows what your teacher's talking about. Probably a good time to start doodling. And you're feeling spirally today, so yeah. Oh, and because of overcrowding in your school, your math class is taking place in greenhouse number 3, plants. Anyway, you've decided there's 3 basic types of spirals. There's a kind where as you spiral out, you keep the same distance, or you could start big but make it tighter and tighter as you go around, in which case the spiral ends. Or you could start tight but make the spiral bigger as you go out. The first kind is good if you really want to fill up a page with lines, or if you want to draw curled up snakes. You can start with a wonky shape to spiral around, but you've noticed that as you spiral out, it gets rounder and rounder. Probably something to do with how the ratio between 2 different numbers approaches one as you repeatedly add the same number to both, but you can bring the wonk back by exaggerating the bumps and it gets all optical illusion-y. Anyway, you're not sure what the second kind of spiral is good for, but I guess it's a good way to draw snuggled up slug cats, which are a species you've invented just to keep this kind of spiral from feeling useless. This third spiral, however, is good for all sorts of things. You could draw a snail or a nautilus shell, an elephant with a curled up trunk, the horns of a sheep, a fern frond, a cochlea, and an inner ear diagram, an ear itself. Those other spirals can't help but be jealous of this clearly superior kind of spiral. Better draw more slug cats. Here's one way to draw a really perfect spiral. Start with one square and draw another next to it that is the same height. Make the next square fit next to both together, that is, each side is length 2. The next square has length 3. The entire outside shape will always be a rectangle. Keep spiraling around, adding bigger and bigger squares. This one has side length 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and now 21. Once you do that, you can add a curve going through each square, arcing from one corner to the opposite corner. Resist the urge to zip quickly across the diagonal if you want a nice smooth spiral. Have you ever looked at the spirally pattern on a pine cone and thought, hey, sure are spirals on this pine cone? I don't know why there's pine cones in your greenhouse. Maybe the greenhouse is in a forest. Anyway, there's spirals, and there's not just one either. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 going this way, or you could look at the spirals going the other way, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Look familiar? 8 and 13 are both numbers in the Fibonacci series. That's the one where you start by adding 1 and 1 to get 2, then 1 and 2 to get 3, 2 and 3 to get 5, 3 plus 5 is 8, 5 plus 8 is 13, and so on. Some people think that instead of starting with 1 plus 1, you should start with 0 and 1. 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 2, 1 plus 2 is 3, and it continues on the same way as starting with 1 and 1. Or I guess you could start with 1 plus 0, and that would work too. Or why not go back one more to -1, and so on. Anyway, if you're into the Fibonacci series, you probably have a bunch memorized. I mean, you've got to know 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Finish off the single digits with 8, and ooh, 13, how spooky. And once you're memorizing double digits, you might as well know 21, 34, 55, 89, so that whenever someone turns a Fibonacci number, you can say, happy Fib birthday. And then, isn't it interesting that 144, 233, 377, but 610 breaks that pattern, so you better know that one too. And oh my goodness, 987 is a neat number, and well, you see how these things get out of hand. Anyway, 'tis the season for decorative scented pine cones, and if you're putting glitter glue spirals on your pine cones during math class, you might notice that the number of spirals are 5 and 8, or 3 and 5, or 3 and 5 again, 5 and 8. This one was 8 and 13, and one Fibonacci pine cone is one thing, but all of them? What is up with that? This pine cone has this lumpy, weird part. Maybe that messes it up. Let's count the top. 5 and 8. Now let's check out the bottom. 8 and 13. If you wanted to draw a mathematically realistic pine cone, you might start by drawing 5 spirals one way and 8 going the other. I'm going to mark out starting and ending points for my spirals first as a guide, and then draw the arms, 8 one way and 5 the other. Now I can fill in the little pine coney things. So there's Fibonacci numbers in pine cones, but are there Fibonacci numbers in other things that start with pine? Let's count the spirals on this thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The leaves are hard to keep track of, but they're in spirals too, of Fibonacci numbers. What if we looked at these really tight spirals going almost straight up? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. A Fibonacci number. Can we find a third spiral on this pine cone? Sure, go down like this. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. But that's only a couple examples. How about this thing I found on the side of the road? I don't know what it is. It probably starts with pine, though. 5 and 8. Let's see how far the conspiracy goes. What else has spirals in it? This artichoke is 5 and 8. So does this artichoke-looking flower thing. And this cactus fruit does too. Here's an orange cauliflower with 5 and 8, and a green one with 5 and 8. I mean, 5 and 8. Oh, it's actually 5 and 8. Maybe plants just like these numbers, though. Doesn't mean it has anything to do with Fibonacci, does it? So let's go for some higher numbers. We're going to need some flowers. I think this is a flower. It's got 13 and 21. These daisies are hard to count, but they have 21 and 34. Now let's bring in the big guns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 17, 20, 24, 42, 53, 54, 55. I promise this is a random flower and I didn't pick it out specially to trick you into thinking there's Fibonacci numbers and things, but you should really count for yourself next time you see something spirally. There's even Fibonacci numbers in how the leaves are arranged on this stalk, or this one, or the Brussels sprouts on this stalk are a beautiful, delicious 3 and 5. Fibonacci is even in the arrangement of the petals on this rose, and some flowers have shown Fibonacci numbers as high as 144. It seems pretty cosmic and wondrous, but the cool thing about the Fibonacci series and spiral is not that it's this big, complicated, mystical, magical supermath thing beyond the comprehension of our puny human minds that shows up mysteriously everywhere. We'll find that these numbers aren't weird at all. In fact, it would be weird if they weren't there. The cool thing about it is that these incredibly intricate patterns can result from utterly simple beginnings.
It's interesting, isn't it? So you can go a lot deeper onto this, and as she says in the closing comment, is actually it would be weird if this wasn't the case, if there wasn't pattern underpinning things, because if you like, we're all a product of the same seemingly chaotic forces, but chaos always comprehends the patterns. This is really, really fascinating. So we briefly, I can't remember now who I had this conversation with, probably Sean, we talked a little bit about the I Ching, which is the Chinese book of change. And it identifies 64 points on the compass of change. And what it says within the idea within the sort of the philosophy is that change seems like random events, but those random events, when we take them with a bigger perspective and placed in time, we realize that they also conform to patterns. And maybe by consulting with random events like dividing yarrow stalks or flipping coins, we can identify where we are in the big cycle of change. It's pretty crazy, pretty exciting, interesting. I'm going to just pause that line of inquiry, and I'm going to take us in not a different direction. Oh, it's 11:11. That's another significant moment, isn't it? Anyway, so we're going to go to design. We're going to talk about design in permaculture, and again, so my premise, what I was saying to you from the beginning of this, is that how do we make sense of complexity? We do that by seeing patterns. We see the universality of the uniqueness of each moment, the uniqueness of a snowflake, the uniqueness of a spider's web, the uniqueness of a fingerprint, the uniqueness of a moment in time. That we make sense of those things because we've seen the pattern before. So we're going to bring all of those ideas and think about how we relate to the natural world and how we go about understanding how to arrange elements and systems in a way in which they fulfill our intended goals. This is a cover of a book. I can't quite remember the name of the book, but it was obviously it's to do with permaculture design. And I liked I just wanted to grab the picture because it sort of showed a design process and gives us perhaps just a little chance to look at what a permaculture design might look like. Okay, let's try and deconstruct this picture for the purposes of understanding that. And I'm going to overlook some details I don't know. I'm also going through the same process as you, deconstruction. So let's have a look. We've got some contours. Contours describe the shape and altitude of the land, what we might call the topography, its shape, and also gives a sense of its and what we have here, we have, I don't know whether we're in meters or feet, it doesn't matter, 100. 34 meters, 100 feet. I think that's what we've got there. What's that? That's anyway, whatever, I don't mind. I don't care. 100. Basically what we're saying is the land slopes downhill. There's a road at the bottom. It has a name. It's called Dawson Road. And at the top, so we're going from 100 to 95 to 90 to whatever this is, 80 down the bottom, 85, 80. So it's a continuous slope, but it's also got a shape to it. Look, that we've got some drainage. So it looks like there's a stream crossing here. And obviously the stream will always, water will gravitate towards the lowest point. We have access. And what we'll notice is that here's Dawson Road. Here's the main, obviously this is the thoroughfare. And there's a driveway coming off. The driveway tries to stay very close to contour because we don't want it to be very steep. But then it's got to turn. It's got to get between one convoy, it's got to turn to get, obviously, to gain height and cross the landscape. And then it gets back to be close to contour again. We see that sort of switchback road side that we see a lot, and it's climbing. And one of the things that we might want to think about if we were doing a design like this is understand how this road might interact with the flow of water across the landscape. Maybe we can use the road to interact with the flow of water and to direct that water somewhere where we might want it. Anyway, let's not get into too much detail. So look, this road makes the quickest, easiest, straightest line functionally across a steep landscape to reach the settlement. Here is the house. So we've got access, and then we've got settlement. So wherever we have our house, we're going to cluster functions around that, cluster elements around that house that support the function of a home zone. So let's call this zone 1. Let's see this as the center point, because this is where there's going to be the most activity. We're going to arrive here at the center, at the site, enter the house, and look around the house. We have, this looks to me like a raised beds. This looks like some kind of a garden, and this looks like a lovely little keyhole, beds and things in it, lots of edge, facing towards the access of the house. Maybe this is a herb garden. Maybe that garden, because it's very close to the house, is very easy to access, and we'll have multiple interactions happening because we're going out and coming back loads of times. A sprig of mint, sprig of thyme, and maybe other very high maintenance things we might put out here because we're constantly observing what's happening here as we're running in and out between the home and the garden. So maybe if we've got the baby out in a pram on a nice day, we'll put it here because we can keep an eye on it, keep it safe. The wolf comes, we can protect the baby. Whatever these other things are here, maybe looks like we've got a bit of an orchard. So we've got maybe this zone 1 type garden, a herb garden, maybe a bit further away from the house, more veg gardens and things. And then whatever this is here. It says something, shelter belt and fire break. Anyway, okay, look, so we're grouping things together. We've grouped a series of elements together, whatever these are, it doesn't even matter, that in some way reinforce the home function, whether it's herbs, veg, some fruits or whatever. Also notice there's a tank here, and I would imagine that tank would represent where we have a house. We've got hard paths, we've got sealed surfaces, we've got driveways, we've got roofs. Those are things which collect water but don't allow it to percolate into the ground. So we want to collect that water from this zone and store it as high in the system as we can and as close to where we might want to use it so we can fill our watering tanks to care for the garden. So we've got strategic placements of elements to fulfill desired functions. Now, we don't know what the functions of this landscape are exactly, but I'm guessing it's a settlement, it's a home, and obviously we're putting those things around it that are going to make that suitable. Now, other features that we can see is if we go far away, all the way across this landscape to over here, it says here zone 5, and it says bush regeneration area. Now, why might we be doing bush regeneration over here? Well, it's as far away as the house as we can get while still being on the land. And bush regeneration is a kind of zone 4, zone 5 activity. It doesn't require you to be there all the time. It doesn't require you to there be moving a sprinkler or, pricking out seedlings. This is your scatter pattern. This is nature, allowing nature to do its thing, to express itself. That's what we do in zone 5 is we observe nature, we gain new insight, but we make very few, if any, interactions because we don't really know whether those reactions, it's hard for us to observe whether those interactions and whether they're functional, how they perform, because we're very rarely there. One interaction that we have done is where we see a through flow of water is we strategically slowed it down. We've spotted a pattern. The pattern is water flows downhill, and look, here we've got a little swale harvesting any water falling from here more broadly is just subtly, gently steered towards our first dam. That dam's going to fill up and overflow. That water has to go somewhere. So we return it back to the watercourse where it came from. And again, we've got a similar approach. We've got a swale going across, harvesting any, if this breaks its banks or if we get a heavy flood event, any water there is still directed back into the channel, or again, we can slow it down, catch and store, prevent it from eroding, keep it in the system as long as we can, so we can get as many yields as we can. And then again, we've done that a third time, and then it's flowing into where it says existing dam. So we've got a low dam there already, but by adding 2 other higher ones, we've actually added a greater degree of control to the system. We've reduced erosion, and we're containing the water within a system. And then that's extra water there now would be enough to support the function of natural regeneration. So maybe we've done enough interactions out in zone 5 to know that our wildlife and biodiversity bit is kind of sorted, and we can concentrate then back in the home zone and more intensely, closer to where we are. So we've got some zone 1 and some zone 2 things as we go out from the house. Zone 3 is your main crop. Zone 3 is the commercial production. That's where you in zone 3, you're trying to create surpluses. So if we abstract out the zoning idea, it becomes the world of work. So you go down the coal mine, or you go to your publishing house, Lindsay, or wherever it is that you're doing, to earn work to work. So work's a deliberate act. You put your work clothes on, you get on the bus at the right time, and you go to work, and you do your stuff, and they pay you money. So that's your surplus. That's what you've got now to take care of yourself, and hopefully have something left over so you can donate to permaculture projects in East Africa, for example. Not trying to plant a thought there, but anyway, just having fun. Okay, look, so the world of work. So in this design, we've got grapevines. There's a yield. Obviously, we can harvest that yield. We can ferment the grapes. I think Sean's already knows where we're going with this, and that's part of our yield. But look, also these grapevines are on contour. Look, they are they're following the lines of the contour, so they're also helping reinforce the landscape in another way as well. And we're reducing erosion and slowing down the flow of water downhill. So the shape of this, the form of these grapevines are on contour with the intention of reinforcing the landscape. That might not be the only consideration. We've got to think about the solar aspect and so forth, but let's keep this simple. Now we've got this water tank here. Imagine if we were to get a real deluge of water, it started overflowing, we would want that water tank to discharge into areas where there's vegetation. So we've got extra vegetation here, which also helps strengthen that slope. So if we had a surplus of water going down, it couldn't erode. We've also got commercial production trees, zone 3. So this big swathe across the middle of the farm is growing whatever it is, whether it's fruit or timber, but this is the main yield of the farm. We've got grapes as part of that, yet zone 3 yield. But we've also got all these other things, whatever these are. Over here, we're into zone 4. And zone 4 are, again, long-term tree crops, things that we don't have to interact with a lot and don't need a lot of our attention. So we might have some of these individual fruit trees. We might have 1 or 2 up in our orchard around our house. So that when we can see the cherry tree there is ready for picking, we can go down over to here to pick our cherries. So we've got a cold climate orchard sat down here, maybe because cold air is heavier and travels down the bank here. Who knows what thinking there is in this, but I'm going to stop there. But what you can see is there's a deliberate placement of elements within a system that conform to patterns in a way in which it's a conscious placement of elements, in a way in which those things fulfill a desired function, whether it is water catchment, allowing regeneration to happen, shelter belt or fire belts. We've got food functions supported around the house. There's a little shed for our tools or whatever else these other things might be. Bringing you into, not to labour at this point, bringing you into that thinking about how we think about approach design in permaculture. So design is a process. It's not a singular event. It's a process and it's ongoing. And it works on feedback and evolution like everything else on the planet. Permaculture design is a process that runs on feedback. I like this. Design is a process of making dreams come true. doesn't just have to be a dream. It's about, yeah, it's about bringing. So here's a thought is, this means more than what it says. What it means is, if you can visualize something, if you can have a set of objectives in mind, then you can break that down into steps. Then we can then have a process and a strategy, a time-based series of sequence of events that enables our dream to transfer from our imagination and manifest itself in the real world. This is magic. It kind of is. And this is what we have the ability to do. And this is what I want you to help you feel that you can do, and to give you the confidence to approach doing it without feeling you have to digest every book on every subject first. Because permaculture is much more about doing than the thinking. Yes, do your planning, make your mistakes on paper, we already said, but also is then, as you go forward, start with small things that you can learn from. Design is a process. I like this. This next one is the 9 principles of biomimicry. So we're not the only people, permaculturalists. We do not have a exclusive handle on observing nature. Every other discipline is doing the same. Janine Benyus, I remember seeing a talk of hers on YouTube. I think it was a TED talk, actually, TED.com. Really interesting. And obviously, biomimicry is a very scientific approach of copying natural processes and understanding that nature is incredibly energy and resource efficient. It makes the snail shell with the minimum amount of material strong, it's light, it's durable, its shape is functional. There's so much that we can learn from this. And yet it's sort of spontaneously forming almost through very simple processes. This is what we need to know. This is what we need to bring into our design frameworks and stuff. So what does Janine Benyus observe from nature, and how does that resonate with what we've been talking about for the whole of last week? Well, number one, she notices that nature runs on sunlight. Okay, we're with you on that, Janine. The only new energy coming into the system is from the sun. And then number two, nature uses only the energy that it needs. So it's okay, the only energy coming is from the sun, and nature is very efficient at doing that. It only takes what it needs. So set limits to consumption. Oh, look, there's our ethic. We've got this. This is already resonating for me quite well. Nature fix form to function. Well, I've just been parroting that to the point of making everybody feel bored, and I'm not going to stop. And that's because we really mean it. So look at this. I don't know if this was why we have this picture of this moth. Here's a lovely moth, and it looks a bit silly. It's got a big antennae sticking out of his head and this strange proboscis. Obviously, what matters is that the moth can navigate itself through a complex world without bumping into walls and things, and that it can feed and reproduce. So it looks like what it looks like because that works. And this design looks like what it looks like is because it works. It fulfills the intended functions. Nature recycles everything. Hello, principle 6, produce no waste, endless cycling. Number 5, nature rewards cooperation. Well, that's principle 8, integrate rather than segregate. I've already told you, we're deliberately designing to create mutually beneficial relationships. We're building on symbiosis, on cooperation. I'm going to take you, we're going to look at the principles of cooperation and Robert Owen's work a bit later on, because that 5th thing here that Janine is observing is absolutely key. So, you know, some of us are loners, some of us are pioneers. We want to go out and do our own, you know, make our mark on the world sort of thing. But we're going to do it much better if we can cooperate. So there's a lot to learn about how we might approach to do that. Number 6, nature banks on diversity. And we also talked about how over time, natural systems move from very simple things like bare stone walls with lichens on them to complexity like our rainforest. That as there's diversity of connections, of elements, and the connections between them develops, so that system becomes stronger. So there's its banking on diversity. We've just talked about that with the web pattern and interconnections in ecosystems. Number 8, nature curbs excesses from within. Hello, coronavirus. Think of all of the excesses of human behavior that are now being curbed by a natural process of genetic evolution. It's created a selection pressure for a particular virus, which is now limiting our destructive behavior by reducing the amount of plane flights we can make and the amount that we can dash around and stuff, because we become more exposed to the virus the more we move around. There's many, I just use an example because it's obviously very topical, but think about all of those. It's a bit chilling actually, but then also just think, so again, think of a tree, if it has a really cold, hard winter, it will give up on some of its outer branches or some of its outer roots, retreat to its sort of core to make sure they can withstand a time of adversity. So excesses curbed from within, self-pruning. Think about that. Think about, again, it's about the more that we can trim our own excesses, then actually the stronger the hub becomes, the self becomes. And nature taps the power of limits. Okay, we're gonna do a whole little presentation about limiting factors in design. I think it's very important. The power of limits is, example is a very low nutrient environment with very few nitrates in it, means that most plants can't flourish in that environment. But some specialist plants, those leguminous plants, can exploit that to their advantage because they can fix their own nitrogen. So in some ways, that's nature tapping the power of limits. I think that's what that means. Interesting. So look, Janine Benyus, she's coming from a very much more scientific and, should we say, academic start point than we are, but she's really making observations, maybe using a slightly different language and slightly different order, because she's not a permaculture designer, but she's spotting all the same things. And I think these things greatly go in into the process of reinforcing our own design understanding. That's, yeah. I'm super interested in seeing how, again, I've probably said this already, different people describe the same things. Here is, this is from, this is biomimicry too. This is a biomimicry diagram. So maybe some of these similar kind of ideas expressed in a slightly different way. It says in the middle, life creates conditions conducive to life. Succession. You know, it was life on Earth that built the atmosphere. It was life on Earth that built the soils that then enable us to have dinosaurs and, you know, and other things. So nature is adapt. What else have we got around here? It says sunlight, water, and gravity. We've talked about that a lot. Dynamic non-equilibrium, limits and boundaries, cyclic processes, and Earth's operating conditions. So if you like, all of these things are bound by these other bigger observations. So adapt to changing conditions, principle 12. Be locally attuned and responsive. It's about strategic placement, responding to conditions, catch and store energy stuff. Use life-friendly chemistry. What are we thinking? Producing all these toxins, dumping them in environments, and then expecting them to not go on and cause further downstream problems. We have to stop using pesticides. We have to stop releasing heavy metal ions into the environment in an unchecked way, because it has other consequences. So there's big learning that we have to bring into our behaviors. Can you bring it into your own behaviors? Can you think about how you can use life-friendly chemistry? We have an operating system at Dragons Co-op, and that we oblige ourselves to use biological, non-toxic cleaning products. We don't put loads of bleach down our bath. We use, you know, bio-sensitive things. Why wouldn't we? You know, be resource efficient, both material and energy. Integrate development with growth. That's an interesting idea. And evolve to survive. So what's the difference between evolve to survive and adapt to changing conditions? Obviously, one's a function of the other. Okay, just moving on, but just interesting. And none of this disagrees with what we're talking about. Okay, here is a little exploration about design. This was put together by a friend of mine who was a guitar maker. He's retired from that now, and he does gardening, and he's got interested in permaculture. This was his exploration. He did this for me quite some years ago, and I've come back and looked at this work a few times. And I thought, yeah, it's interesting, and it gets us to think out of the box a little bit. So I like it. And what he said is, we're designing to function. Okay, but what our design might look like and the process that we use is going to be an interactive process depending on the designer, the skills, knowledge, experience, perspectives of the person who's in that role. The materials are available. Do we have sticks? Do we have stones? Do we have, water or whatever? And the application, or I would say the function. So it's an interesting two-way thing. So we might, as a designer, we might think a lot very abstractly and creatively about the application or the function that we're trying to create. And then we might look really creatively at the materials that we have lying around. And we're thinking about how can we combine the materials through a design process to fulfill the application. And there's some way, and a two-way sort of exchange between those things. So again, is as an individual designer working to fulfill a function with the materials that might just be unique to the time and place that you're in, each design is going to be unique. But if that design can fulfill the intended function, then it's viable. So it doesn't matter what it looks like. Okay, Ian's a musician. The guy, Ian Watts, this guy who created this slideshow, I've used it a few times now. And he's wondering about how these things might have come about. How did we create our first instrument? What observations did we make of the natural world? And also what observations did we make about the emotional impact it had on us hearing music for the first time or whatever. So as humans have evolved, we've done exactly this, what Ian has said. We've interacted with the materials lying around us, and we've discovered applications from them by having an inquiring mind. So this is a thigh bone of a bird, and maybe that bird had been captured and roasted on the fire for dinner, and sat around sucking the marrow out of the bone. You've eaten, you enjoyed your meal, fatty stuff all in your beard, or if you happen to have a beard. I noticed some of you didn't, but anyway, as you're sucking on your bone, you get a noise. Ooh, toot. Ooh, that's interesting. So you just for a bit of amusement, you find yourself blowing through this bone and sucking on it maybe and discovering its audio properties. And then somehow you might notice that the length of the bone seems to affect the tone or the note or the frequency. And then somehow through experimentation, we might notice that by drilling little holes in places that we can change the tone or change the note. So we've got a musical instrument, and it's not hard to imagine the sort of simple logic processes that there's the designer interacting with the materials, and once she's got the idea of the function is making sounds, we can now explore that. How do we create a variety of sounds? This is at least 50,000 years old. I mean, who knows? I'm sure we've been playing around with sound and music, certainly with our voices, for a very long time, since the most basic form of communication. Here's someone playing with their voice. You notice that if you shape your mouth, oh, ooh, ah, ooh, the sounds change. So we have some kind of, again, basic understanding about resonating air in a space, that it amplifies it, and that we change the shape of the space. The noises change. Okay, everybody's playing with these things. See how babies discover their voices and play with sound. It's the most natural thing in the world. So again, it's observe and interact. which is how the design process works, by playing, testing out ideas. So who knows what one of the earliest tools that we might have made, humans, but a bent stick with a bit of sinew, a bit of animal sinew across it maybe, might have been a very early thing that we did create as a tool, because we could start fire, couldn't we, by using that as a bow to accelerate the rotation of the stick to create heat, friction, heat through friction to start a fire. Obviously, there's a bow and arrow, but whatever it is that people notice, and maybe they notice this also from skinning an animal and getting the food out of it, was that these tendons, these bits of sinew or whatever, that when they're taut, they go budoing, and it makes a fun sound. Budoing, what does that mean? Maybe from whether it's from archery or from lighting fires or just from playing with exploring the carcass of an animal maybe that we'd found or hunted. We noticed this sound thing. Okay, so let's bring those two ideas together. We've got the budoing of the string and we've got the resonance of the mouth. If we put those two things together, we're really onto something. We've made a quantum leap in terms of now we can control the sound and the pitch, and we can create this very interesting budoing sound from the resonance of the fibre of the bit of whatever it is, gut or sinew or rope or twine that we've now got on our bent stick. We can change how strong how bent the stick is, or how the tension of the bit of sinew, and again that changed the pitch and the resonance. People have just played with these things. So you might have come across a berimbau in a Brazilian dance martial art called capoeira. There's lots of falling and tumbling, so they're interested in how the body moves and things like that, but also it's musical and follows musical forms. So here we have now very basic evolution of this idea. We've got the bent stick, now it's got a wire on it, it looks like, and the resonator, the amplifier, instead of having to use your mouth, we've now got looks like a gourd shell. But so we've understood the same natural processes, we're playing with those things for an intended function, but we're getting a little bit more sophisticated because as designers, we have different materials and processes to work with. Next. We can then take that up a level, can't we? We can have more than one string. We've noticed that strings of different lengths create different sounds. And also is here we've got whether it's a gourd or a tortoise shell or something, but we've now stretched a skin over it. We might have noticed that from drums, from exploring audio properties in other materials, that we can somehow bring that tense tension of like the skin over something that some resonate, echo. We can now get some different qualities going. We've got something we might have learned from making drums, and we brought our tensile string budoing kind of thing into the same design now. You can see where we're going with this. And then motor that forward thousands and thousands of years. Here's a very early guitar created in the Baroque period in Italy. And what you're seeing is something that is enormously complex. We've now got frets, we've got these keys, we've got these machine heads, we've got this ability to change the tension in the string. We can choose, we've got fingerings on the neck so that we can change the finger lengths by pushing our fingers on it. And we've got strings of different lengths and different thicknesses. So there's a whole range, a palette of sounds that we can choose to create, way into how we choose to interact with the instrument. To me, there's other functions being communicated by this guitar, by this design. It's ostentatious. It's saying I'm rich, I'm important. This is a material. This is a musical instrument for rich people. This is not going to be available to the proletariat. So there's something here about music had maybe come from a very, very humble form, sitting around the campfire, sucking on your turkey bone, to something there that is in the realm of kings and popes and landed gentry and what have you. So something obviously so important. Music became at the pinnacle and center of society and culture, especially in this time, Italy in the 17th century, very, very important creative time, evolution. There's another product of that same era, that really, really important era in human evolution. There's another fantastic guitar. It looks like it's a 20 string guitar, is it? Or a 10 string guitar. We've got strings in pairs. It's a bit like a 12 string, but with in five pairs. Again, we've got the fretboard. We've got now this sound hole. So we've got a, if you like, this resonating type of wood. We've gone past having a bit of animal hide, but we've got a different kind of wood on the sides because that's structural. And this wood on the front is resonating for amplifying the sound. So we're getting quite masterful now of how to choose materials, how to combine them together, and create something, a machine, which is quite complex. This is beautiful. Look at the detail. This is just a sound hole. Look at, again, that's a designer, an artisan showing off, creating value. But again, this is something high, very, very, very valuable. Think about how much people must have valued music, or same time how perhaps they wanted to be ostentatious and show off their wealth or their skill. Interestingly, this was made in 1700 by Antonia Stradivari, a very famous instrument maker who made lots of violins as well. And violins is primarily what you would have heard it from. But again, think how he could adapt the skill set from making violins to making guitars. Here's an early American guitar from 1840, created by Martin. And there's some design features which are kind of interesting, which we've got the shape of that sort of scroll on the end, which we associate with violins. And then, well, there's a violin. Okay, thoughts about all of that? Think about this really, really detailed. Basically, we've got a very simple principle, and that's been explored by designers with different materials, with different objectives in mind. And it's created things like these beautiful things, whether it's this lovely Baroque guitar, the Stradivari, the Martin. Okay, these are kind of the peak of certain evolutionary timelines, if you like, taking simple form, expressing it with more complexity. But let's go somewhere else with this story, because this is why guitars are so interesting to me, and perhaps to you. I hope so, I don't know if, but is this guy. His name is Charlie Christian. He was a very early jazz and blues player, and something along the line in the guitar's evolution, something very, very interesting happened. Because you can imagine the artistry, the artisanship involved in making one of these things, it makes them expensive. It takes it out of the hands of the everyman. We lose our marimba around the campfire, and now we're in the concert hall with the, people from the conservatoire who've studied half their life how to master this thing. So that it's become something very elite and highly, highly, highly specialized. This guy represents the movement of these technologies into the popular realm, and with folk music, blues, traditional music, jazz. This guy, you recognize him. He took, again, a sort of an established musical form, but he found a way of doing it in a way in which no one had heard before. And in doing that, created a whole new world of sonic possibilities, a whole new way of expressing feeling and emotion, a whole new way of expressing ideas. When Jimi Hendrix played the United States national anthem on his distorted Fender Stratocaster, somehow the world changed. And somehow that thing came into ownership of those people, or something like that. Something very, very, very important happened somewhere along in the 20s, 30s, 40s, that then gave rise to the explosion of musical expression that happened, especially in the 60s. And this is it. This is what happened, is they started to, instead of do a wonderful Baroque inlay, mahogany, ivory, fantastically expensive thing, we started to apply industrial processes. What we learned how to mass produce cars, munitions and guns and stuff in the war, in the wars, we also started to realize that we could apply those mass production techniques, this evolution, if you like, or development in the way we think, to mass produce musical instruments. This was a new thing. Before, you'd have to either make your own, you have a very basic rudimentary kind of thing, like your berimbau player, or it would be something that was expression of artistry that was out of the reach of you and I. So look, it's a plank of wood. That's all it is. It doesn't have amazing acoustic properties. Famously, Brian May, the guitarist at Queen, him and his dad made him his first guitar out of the mantelpiece in their living room. Sawed the plank. Basically, you get a machine router, you rip out some holes. That's only so you can put the components in. And the components of electric guitar are very, very simple. Coils and magnets, just basic electrical, things. You could buy them from Radio Shack or whatever, from your standard sort of supplier. Nothing too special there. And set it up in the right way, and then suddenly, we're in a whole new ball game. So look, springs and coils and magnets. That's it. It's not much to it. But now we've created something that is. We can now put this in the hands of anybody who has an interest in playing it. So we've changed the rules. Suddenly these instruments are everywhere, and there's an explosion in creativity. It's very, very amazing tool. This is a Gibson Les Paul. Some of the modern era's greatest players played this instrument. Has particularly sort of preciseness to it, and well, particular playability. We're talking about Jimmy Page out of Led Zeppelin. We're talking about Paul Kossoff out of Free, whatever. It's some of these really, really masterful players. Peter Green out of Fleetwood Mac. These guys played Les Pauls and create some of the most exciting and most enduring music of all time came from this period. And I wonder whether that was just a surge of creativity. There was obviously cultural change, social change. We were coming out of a war period, out of austerity. We put these creative tools in people's hands, and they created a sonic landscape that had not existed. No one had done this before. If you think from Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley in the very early 50s to early 60s, the Beatles and the Stones, and next 2 or 3 years later, suddenly you've got the most extraordinary musical form we can imagine. And then from that comes a diversity of different kinds of guitars and shapes for fun, for expressing. Pop music's about fun, it's about creativity. But just before we break out, because I accept that this is probably going a little bit far away from the permaculture canon, but I want to talk about a couple of different particular players I think are fantastically interesting to consider. One is Tony Iommi. This guy's from Birmingham, and Birmingham, they bash sheet steel. You get this of big steel ingots and they're big hammers, and they bang it into sheet steel, going using car factories and cutlery factories and stuff like that. Manufacturing, West Midlands, Wolverhampton, Birmingham, Black Country. It's kind of on the edge of where I come from. So I have an empathy and interest in those areas. And as a young man, Tony Iommi worked in the factories where they have these big hammers hammering the steel, and he'd lost the fingertips on his left hand in an accident. To play guitar, he had to have little like leather cups made for his fingers so that he could actually fret on the fretboard. So even though he had a malformation or an injury, he was able to adapt himself for the instrument. There's something interesting about that. And but something else specifically about Tony Iommi, which is just interesting about their own individuality and stuff, is this was in a period, imagine 1968, 1969, 1970, whenever it was, and the whole world's starting to have these new toys. They started to hear these new sounds that they'd never heard before, like electrified blues or whatever. And it's just so exciting to people trying to make it their own. So the bit of uniqueness that was interesting, that why I like this story, is Tony Iommi and his mates were in a little rehearsal room in Birmingham. Obviously, Ozzy Osbourne, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, if you know your music, very famous people they've become. And I believe that it was at the time of the movie The Omen, and that people were queuing outside the cinema to see The Omen, see a horror film. And Tony Iommi asked the question is, what would be the musical equivalent of a horror film? So rather than just playing whatever broken down 12-bar blues like everybody else was doing back then, he asked himself the question is, what would a musical form be that communicated dark and scary ideas rather than happy hippie ideas or she loves you, yeah, yeah, yeah type ideas? And with that one thought, they created a new genre of music, heavy metal. And not only that is, heavy metal has now broken into many, many, many subgenres: speed metal, black metal, death metal, I don't even know what, crazy hair metal has been, with a glam, punk, whatever. All of that comes from one innovative thought from a guy who then changed his guitar, tuned his guitar down a whole octave, and started playing very slowly and deliberately and kind of grungy with a bit of distortion. And I challenge anybody to go back and listen. It's on YouTube. Go listen to the first Black Sabbath album. It's utterly awesome. It's now 50 years old. Well, it's absolutely incredible to think that these were not accomplished musicians. Ozzy Osbourne just been released from prison for breaking an entry. They weren't sophisticated musicians, but they had a very, very clear function in mind of creating a clever soundscape that was a bit dark and scary. And it's utterly, utterly incredible. So this is now regarded as a very, very, very significant point in modern musical development, was just these guys having an idea. So there's my little story. Next one is another one, and it's a bit about designing to limitations. And again, you could say, to a certain extent, Black Sabbath designed around their own limitations to create truly exciting, interesting, atmospheric music that wasn't necessarily massively complex, but represented what they were, within their capabilities. So this guy, if you know him, he was born in the Camargue in south of France to, I guess, people we would call gypsies or Romanis, migratory people, lives in caravans and what have you. And as a baby, I think, or a young child, was a fire. And Django was pulled from the flames, but he had lost 2 fingers and half a thumb. So on his left hand, he only has 2 fingers and half a thumb, and the rest is missing. And he's a naturally musical and creative guy. So you could go, oh, I want to be a guitar player, but I'm missing half my hand, so therefore I can't be a guitar player, and I could be sad and miserable for my life. Or you could say, I wonder if I can create a guitar picking finger style that is just for having 2.5 fingers. Well, hello, welcome to Django Reinhardt's world. Django Reinhardt not only mastered a musical form which he created, but he created a form that was so exciting and so energizing to people around the world that everybody else tried to copy it. And there would have been, guitarists who almost wishing away 2.5 fingers so they could be like Django, so they could play like him. Designing to limitations. I think, again, Tony Iommi lost the tips of his fingers. Did that stop him? No. He evolved a style that suited his own capabilities, and that was still enough for both of these guys to create a musical form that was unique, and it has outlived them by many years, and been copied around the world. So there's an interesting thing. Guitar designs by other people. These I think that Ian himself would come up with. Maybe one you could have a bass and a treble in one instrument, or go for really lovely shapes that just look exciting, interesting, or fit around your body in certain ways. Anyway, and there's a guitar by Picasso, the feelings and emotions of hearing a guitar being played, to get a different representation of the same thing. But form follows function, which takes us into the world of design. So okay, I take you on a meander there to think about that. I like talking about rock music because I grew up loving it. It hasn't really quite gone away. And we're going to start a little design conversation now. We've come up to the hour. I overran before, so can we just say I'm going to give you 5 minutes. We're going to come back at 12:05 and start on time. So just if you need a pee or need to freshen your teacup, I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, that was our designated 5 minutes. And on we go with design. And on we return to Nyero Rocks in eastern Uganda, Teso sub-region. We are looking at some more cave paintings from the same site. And we're seeing concentric rings. Again, I was interested about zones, the zoning idea, which I'll expand on. I was interested in looking at these and seeing maybe seasons or worlds within worlds or different relationships. Again, yeah, anyway, an understanding of pattern formation, understand the complexity of the real world and to communicate that to other tribe members or perhaps even to communicate their cultural ideas over through time. Who knows? But something interesting about that, something deliberate and chosen, and yeah, interesting use of materials and location. Very interesting location actually where these are. It's a very striking place. So what's the process that we go through in creating design? How do we make choices? How do we go through that? We've kind of seen that. I'll take you to the musical instrument thing to sort of take you away from just thinking about landscape and where to put your polytunnel and stuff. We're trying to think about design in a more sort of wider context than just thinking about designing gardens. So yeah, bit of fun thinking about music, thinking about where heavy metal came from or gypsy jazz or whatever, but it's a function between the designer, the materials and the intention. That's what I'm trying to say. And that just because you've got half a hand missing or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't enter that world, or you're not even necessarily a massively great musician. I mean, Tony Iommi became a really great guitar player, but really in those early days, it was quite simple what they were doing. So the thing was his creativity more than his skill. I think that's one of my points. Okay, so let's think about design as a process, and let's understand that there's lots of different ways we can do it. One way to design is just to scatter things, just throw it in randomly and then work with what works. So there's a random assembly, that scatter pattern design. I'm going to look at and there's also the designing by increments, as we start with a little thing and then we see how that works and we respond to that and we build on that and go into it. Well, that's also a valid way of doing things. But let's look at processes and realize as well is that if we look at lots of different processes, we might want to evolve our own one, which we are kind of happy with. So the science, I mean, science is a design process. So we'll look at that. Now, Toby Hemingway, I've mentioned him by name. We haven't actually looked at his stuff. Sometimes I do really go into his stuff. I really like his approaches. He was a great communicator. Sadly, we lost Toby in 2016 in the big cull. His book, Gaia's Garden, is, I think, to date still the biggest selling permaculture book. And we'll look at his thing. Coburg and Bagnall, I don't know really who they are. I picked it out of something else, just because I thought it was interesting. And let me go to the other one. Okay, so the scientific process is we observe the natural world. We come up with something that we want to understand better, a hypothesis, a question. We test that question against reality. So we go away and we devise some tests that test our hypothesis. So if it's our simple hypothesis, water flows downhill, does it always flow downhill? Is it always exactly downhill? In what way does that manifest itself, or the variance of that? What things might interact with the flowing of water downhill? You can see how so there's our original observation. We might start asking some questions. Some hypotheses, hypothesi, or whatever, and then work out how to test them. Analyze those results, and from those results, draw a conclusion. Simple. You can see it's a step-by-step process. Okay. So let's expand that, because science is a bit more complex than that, but there's the basic backbone, if you like, of the process. So there's a lovely a little video clip I sometimes use of Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, saying, in science, how do we find out something new? How do we test the theory? Is we take a guess, and then we test that guess against reality and see what the results are. And even if the results are the output of the system, it doesn't matter how clever you were or how erudite your original question might have been. If it doesn't test against reality, then the result is false. So let's expand on that. We ask questions. We might do some background research to create more detailed and specific questions. From that background research, we construct a hypothesis. This is the thing that we want to test. This is we might have multiple hypotheses, but we're going to test them one at a time, because if there's loads of different variables, we can't tell which is the thing that's affecting the final outcome. So often in science, we try to contain the complexity of reality to test one aspect at a time. We test with an experiment, and that gives us data, or we test the data to give us a result. I mean, we then do analysis. That means we process that information, and from it we draw conclusions. So was our hypothesis true? If it is, we can write an article and stick it in Science magazine or Nature magazine. And of course, this is the way that science works: is as soon as somebody comes up with a new idea, I've tested my idea, I'm pretty confident it works, I'm going to publish that now in a scientific journal. So the way science works is that has to be peer reviewed. In other words, other scientists make their reputation by taking your test that you did and repeating it and seeing if they get the same result. And if they don't, or if they spot an error in your working out, if you like, they get the kudos that you were hoping to get. So, and this is how the scientific process works: is everybody's refining and testing each other's work to see do we get the same results every time, or was that just unique to your test or to the circumstances or the particular day when you did that experiment, or is it always true? Very, very important. So if the hypothesis is true, we can publish it in the magazine, and then probably what happens is other people will go off and test it as well, and then we can refine these results, and this is how knowledge advances. Or the other thing could happen is you test your hypothesis and you don't get the planned result. So maybe that proves that your hypothesis is incorrect. Or more likely, and maybe interestingly, it also might be partially true. And so in that case, we need to go back and think again. This is the feedback loop. So we test ideas on reality, and if it turns out to be true, we've learned something. If it turns out to be false, we've learned something, but something different. And what we learned from it being false might help us construct a new hypothesis. And we test that against reality, and testing an idea against reality is feedback. That is the feedback that drives evolution, you know? Going back to our scatter pattern, nature creates genetic variation happily, mutation happily, creates lots of versions, very similar versions of the same thing. Test those against reality. Let's see which ones work best. Put 1 million dandelion seeds out there. Everyone is ever so slightly different, and some of them will do better than others, and that will then somehow improve the genome of the dandelion, or whatever it is that we're looking at. So this is the same with ideas. And so how you generate your hypothesis, it might be through very, very careful thought and background research, or it might be through scatter pattern. Let's just try what happens if we paint it black. Let's paint it blue and see what happens there. Test it on reality. However it is that we might go about this process. It could be very, very thoughtful, or it could be quite random. But the important point here is we do the analysis, the thinking, the computation, the processing of data to, again, draw conclusions so we can learn. This is science in its purest form. Okay, let's go to Toby. In Gaia's Garden, he talks about making observations. So this is gardening more. This is design. This is more design as a scientific process, design and gardening. And this is Toby Hemingway's first book. He's trying to make it simple for you. He's trying to reduce complex patterns down to simple ones. I say I've got some raw, unpasteurized, unhomogenized milk from Babinswood Farm, and my tea is just delicious. I'm enjoying that very much. Okay, probably didn't need to know that, but I shared it with you anyway. Okay, Toby Hemingway. We start from observation. So again, it's look at maybe how those people right at the beginning of this slideshow observed their land. They thought, where are the steep bits, where are the shallow bits? What would be the likely place to bring in the access? You know, what's the shape of it? What's the climate like? And then also what are our intentions? What are we trying to achieve? What of that might come from observing the land, and then creating a vision for what's possible. Now, I showed you that lovely hand drawing that someone had done of a community garden that led to the creation of the compost factory garden. Visioning. We created a vision that we could all understood what that was about and so we had a kind of a collective long-term goal. Now, of course, the real garden didn't look like that, but it had much of those functional, components. So when we built the garden, we all recognized, oh yeah, that fits within our original vision, although the detail was totally different because obviously the first thing is a sketch. So you could say that in the planning of of design, there might be two stages to that. The conceptual stage, and often we plan around functions. We might create a function map or, sort of grouping ideas together, concepts. And then we might break that down to something more detailed, schematic, a scheme, a plan, break it down into steps. We then go into development. So think about how we might bring all those ideas together and order the materials and get the skills and whatever. And then off we go implementing. So there's a very simple offering from Toby Hemingway, what he placed within Gaia's Garden as a kind of just a way to get people into thinking about this process and not to bury them with too much detail. So I like that. This is the bit this is the thing I borrowed. I like this. I've never come across this book though, but so what? Cribbled and Bagwell. They said, and there was a couple of things within this that I liked, and a couple of language things that I wouldn't have used, but none of that matters. So number one is accept responsibility. First stage of design. Oh, the world's a mess. How are we going to make it better? I'm going to do something about it, or whatever it is that we're trying to do. So that's empowering, isn't it? Accept responsibility. I can do something about this. And to a degree, perhaps I might have done that when I looked at the space at Kai Bodvach, and the community started coming together to collect ideas of how to develop it. And I thought, yeah, I can do that. I can help you with that. There's another thing I like to say is if we're always externalizing the blame for things that we're experiencing, we're actively disempowering ourselves from being able to resolve them. So as if the reason the world's all screwed up is because of them. It's because of the conspiracy, the management, the establishment. It's Tony Blair. It's all to do with Maggie Thatcher or what's his name, the Trump character. That's just if those are the faults of the world, or you're putting them out there, is well, what can you do about it? I've got to become an assassin or something. There's not much you can do to create change when you've taken yourself out of the equation. Of course, some people, some collaborations of people, organizations and governments and things have ability to create change more than you do, but that's a different line of thinking. Accept responsibility, feel empowered, realize that you can create change. We're going to do some analysis and thinking to understand the nature of the problem. Now, I told you already that often what happens is we go chasing after the symptoms rather than the problem itself. So the manifestation of the problem rather than the thing that causes it, or whatever it is that we want to address. There's no bigger or more powerful example than climate change. The ice caps are melting, the glaciers are melting, the permafrost is melting, the tundra's melting. We're seeing fires in the Arctic Circle. We're seeing fires on the western seaboard of America. We're seeing fires in Australia. We're seeing erratic weather patterns. What's causing these is a combination of lots and lots of factors. There isn't just one. It's greatly simplistic to say, oh, it's the fires in California because they didn't thin the deadwood out of the trees. Well, that might be an amplifying factor, but the fact that they had the highest recorded temperature ever prior to that is also a factor. And to overlook one in favor of the other would be is making a mistake. And really, neither of those things are the cause of the problem. The cause of the problem is that collectively we're chopping trees down way, way faster than they are regrowing. We're plowing up soils. We're returning carbon to the atmosphere way, way faster than the planet can absorb it. We're burning hydrocarbons. We're filling up the carbon sinks so that they're slowing down. All of these are the reasons why we're causing climate change. So we've got to do some real analysis and defining of the problem before we start generating ideas to which we might use to address them. So again, there's got some different stages here. Self-empowerment, doing analysis, and then really clearly, and in some ways defining the problem is also like, let's say, that's also about identifying functions, what it is that we're trying to, again, these are the same processes, sometimes people use different language. I would never use a word like ideate. It doesn't really mean anything to me. I don't think you can just take a noun like idea and turn it into a verb, but maybe you can. But so what? What it means is generate ideas. Now, I like that. Creative, thinking, brainstorms. Can we look at it from another angle? It's, we do a collective idea generation activity. Maybe a group of people, we might all try and generate some new ideas. Some of those might be good, some of them might be bad, some of them might be half-formed, some of them might be completely wrong, but that doesn't matter when you're in a creative idea generating phase. But what then you do is then you come back and you look at the ideas you generated and you choose the ones that fulfill the function, that address the problem. And you're choosing them not because it's the cleverest idea or the shiniest idea, or it was Dave's idea, or the person with the biggest hat on's idea, or whatever, most important person. You're choosing ideas that address the issue, that fulfill the function. So again, thinking about a selective process, creative and then selective. And then we implement, set those things in motion. And as we implement, so do we evaluate, because we're learning, are we fulfilling that function? Are we addressing that problem? Is it working? Is it what? Now we've made some changes. How has those changes impacted on the rest of the system? This is how we approach design. There's no right or wrong, but the measurement is how well your design fulfills its original function. And we are also very strongly making you think about how it's a process. Okay. These two models are what I wanted you to think about. I'm sorry they're not better drawn. Probably need to take some time out and redraw them, but not today. And this is encouraging you to think of design as a never-ending process. It doesn't actually have a beginning, a middle, or an end. We can jump into the process at any point, but let's, for the sake of simple, whatever, we're going to start somewhere, but let's start here. Living with it. And you'll notice that we've got a matrix. We've got two lines crossing like this, give us 4 different sort of states, 4 different stages of our within our matrix. 1, 2, 3, 4: preparation, imagination, development, and action. You can see how that sits quite well within one of these things that we've had before, so that kind of works. And let's look at the stages within each phase. Let's call these phases. So phase 1, preparation. Well, we start by living with it. Here we are in our house, in our garden, in whatever it is that we're trying to design, and we're experiencing it as it is. So we're making active observations, and through our active observations, we're doing some analysis, as is what's working for me. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Why is it too hot or is it too cold? You know, is it fulfilling its function well or not so well? Am I having to do extra work or bring in extra materials? Who knows what observations might be making? But as we're living with something, whatever that thing is, we're asking ourselves, is it working? Is it fulfilling its functions? And we can do that through experience and through testing and through measurements and so forth. And as we make those observations, we can now feed those into our in analytical processes. And all of these 3 steps, if you like, are the beginning, the preparation stage of designs. So this is the synthesis model, patterns of creativity. I don't have a reference. I'm sorry, I cannot remember where I got this. Sometimes I just, obviously scribbled it down on the back of a fag packet or something, and I just liked it. So apologies for that. I haven't got a source. So in stage 1, living with it, observe, experience, analysis, ask questions. So this next bit of the creativity, this is the creative bit, where we have to come up with some new ideas, some new concepts, because we're doing analysis and we're asking ourselves, not only is something working, but why it might be working, or what changes might we be able to make to improve it. So let's get creative. Let's generate some ideas. Back to this idea of a brainstorm, ideas generation. We might go around and ask lots of people for their opinions. You might get a focus group. We might select some measurements. We might get together and have a series of meetings to generate ideas, and to further understand the analysis, so that we, again, if we're a population of people or a community or whatever addressing a thing, so that we're starting to see things in the same way. We generate those ideas and we harvest the best of them. So again, when we're in a creative phase, anything goes. Anything that works, anything gives you an idea, gives a new perspective. Try studying on your head. Try going out for a day, coming back and looking at it differently. Try climbing up a mountain. Try drinking a pint of wine, whatever it is. Change your perspective, generate some ideas, experience it from different angles. And then we collect those ideas together, what we've generated through imagination, and we harvest. That one looks interesting. Oh, let's try that. I'm interested in whatever. So our next phase then, development, is maybe of those ideas that we've generated, they're a bit half-formed, or you could go, oh, look, that one is kind of like that, but they can sit together. Or imagine if we join these together. Enhance, we perfect, we're adding to it. We're fine-tuning, and then that allows us then to evaluate and think again. Look how we've got analysis and evaluation opposite each other. And we've got living with it, experiencing it, and harvesting, picking out the best from the other. So experience gives us the ability to pick and choose. Analysis gives us the ability to evaluate. There's some other interesting relationships within this model. And we've developed ideas. We're thinking about how we're going to, how well they might operate, what they might look like, what tools we might need, what timeline. Do we do this job in the spring or in the summer, or wait till the winter? How the seasons affect this, or availability of materials. And then that gives us an implementation strategy. Which one are we going to do first? How are we going to go about it? So that brings us into the sort of area of action. We're now actioning our design. As we implement it, so do we live with it. So we now begin to experience our new reality. We've made some changes. We put that was over there, it's now over there, and whatever it is we've done, we brought in some new materials, put those there. How does that feel? Is it working? We start observing and analyzing as we're going through then the next cycle. So all of this is a simple way in which for me to be able to put to you that design doesn't end. It's open-ended. It's an ongoing cycle. You might join it at any stage, because some people might already, be well into this process. But really, this has a kind of a cyclical nature to it. Okay, good, great. So this is a beast of a diagram. I will put a separate A4 PDF or something of this on as a download, and I'll also come back to it. I've got simpler versions of it as well, but one way to remember something complicated is to create an acronym, isn't it? It's a pattern made from the stages. So this is called SADIMAT. SADIMAT is an acronym. It's a made-up word. Doesn't mean anything. It's to help you remember the design sequence. And again, this isn't what permaculture isn't what we do. This isn't defines permaculture, but this is a good example of a permaculture design sequence or process. And that's usually what I ask students to follow when they do their first permaculture designs. And if we all use the same system, we've got something to compare it to with what we've done. So SADIMAT is a design sequence that is survey, analysis, design, implementation and maintenance, evaluation and tweaking. So just 5 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it feeds back on itself, back to survey again in the same way as this does. So we've tried to create a cyclical diagram or a snake process, a flow diagram, I guess. Survey means accept responsibility, analyze, define the problem. Survey means you ask yourself, who's the client? Whose needs are we trying to fulfill through this design? Is it me? Is it you? Is it our family? Is it someone who's paying me to do this? Or the other elements to that client body beyond just the owner, the users, the stakeholders? The more we can gain survey information from the client, the better our design is going to be. So here's why it can be difficult, not difficult, but it's a different process is to design for yourself, because you're actually taking a role of being both client and designer. So I would say, even if you're designing your own backyard or your own permaculture learning pathway, is play a role play, literally wear different hats. Why am I doing this? What do I hope to achieve? Rather, because we don't think like that for ourselves. So anyway, often what I like to do, especially in the permaculture design, PDC design task, is I like to get people to design other people's things, because that makes that very clear that you're now in a design role, not the designer role, not the client role. Anyway, what do we want to get from the client? We want to know what the goals are. What's the function? What's the define the problem? What are you hoping to achieve? What are the, and they may be functions as well. We saw that land design that we looked at the beginning is, it seemed like holding on to water was a function, developing yields for crops was a function, locating the home was a function. So, but we need to be very clear about what the goals of the design are. What's the function of your design? The next thing we want to look at is, okay, we might understand the goals of your design, what it is you're trying to achieve, but the next thing we need to know is what are the values of that client, because there's lots of different ways of getting to a particular goal. So if the goal, the objective, the function is food production, I need as much food as I can from my land because I'm forward about food security. But I overlook to discover that the client is a vegetarian, then I might make some wrong design choices. That's what I mean by goal, by values. They could be all sorts of things, but like I said, in our housing co-op, we have a very clear policy around using non-toxic things and biodegradable things. That might extend to our choice of paints or heating technologies we might use. All of that's defined by our values. So as a designer, so you've got to remember also is your client might not really know what they want because they are caught up in, they're too close to the problem to see it, can't see the wood for the trees. Remember that? That was our statement for the day. So your job as the designer is to help the client discover what they want. And I might have said to you, oh, I want a garden that's whatever, my landscape to feed me, but I neglect to tell you I don't eat fish. Or I forgot to tell you that I am a pescatarian and I only eat fish and vegetables and nothing else. That would really obviously change. I don't know if that's quite a value, but whether it is or not, something like that would totally inform the design. Now, also, there might be things that I genuinely don't know about, and that's actually very highly likely. It's lots of things that your client doesn't know. And so as a designer, you might bring those things into their perspective too. So goals and values are essentially what you're trying to get from the client. And actually resources and constraints are very closely related. So budget, how much money you got, is related to the resource base, really, doesn't it? And if I say to you, it's very important, well, I wanted to design a complex garden landscape for wildlife and biodiversity, and it's very, very, very important to me, and I'm ready to put a lot of energy and time into it, but I have no money. Okay, that's fine. We can still do that. That means that we're going to be collecting seeds from the wild, propagating them, doing things that perhaps the client can help out with because they've said they have loads of time. That's a resource. And they don't have money. That means there's no point in creating up a big plant list of £15,000 and going off to expect to go and buy them. We're going to grow them from seed. Okay, so our design is appropriate to the resources and constraints of the client. Constraints. Django Reinhardt. Oh, I've got 2.5 fingers missing on my hand. Can we still play the guitar? Yes, but we're going to have to come up with a different system for doing it to suit those constraints that you have. I don't know if that's a good example or not. But there you go. These are the things that we need to get from the client. So as a designer, your first layer of very, very, very important information comes from the client. That client might be a community, might be a public body, might be an enterprise, business. If you're working with a school, for example, don't just speak to the head teacher designing a school garden, because I bet you the school teacher won't be the one who's maintaining it. It's going to be the ground staff. Can you speak to someone from the ground staff? They're a client too. Teachers in that school might relate to that school garden too. They might help maintain it. They're probably more, their job is to do education. So can we work with people from the teaching staff of the school, so to understand what their perspectives are as a client? Now, you remember when we were sat outside of Cultivate, I said to you, when we designed the Cultivate Centre, we identified our clients as the landscape manager from the college next door, an educational programs person from the college next door, because we wanted to understand the garden had to look in a way, didn't offend or upset the landscape guy, and it had to have functions built within it that related to the objectives of the educational programs. Happened to be a lady, whatever, doesn't matter. And other people who were going to be clients included Paris Youth Services. So we actually invited Tom, who's the guy who is Paris Youth Services, and said to him, what kinds of activities could we place in our garden that would meet the needs of, would be reflect the goals and values of the youth services. Okay, we said the same to whoever it was, the other neighbours and so forth. So we understood that in developing and designing the Cultivate garden, that the clients represented. Oh, we also added another client who we interviewed, which was nature, wildlife and biodiversity, because that was very much a consideration of the garden. We wanted to meet their needs too. And we invited Sue Stickland, who's a very experienced gardener and a wildlife sensitive gardener, to, if you like, to be the representative of wildlife and biodiversity. What elements can we put in the garden that fulfill your needs? She said, I want water. I want some areas that aren't cultivated. I want some privacy. We can have some busy areas, but we need some quiet areas, nesting sites, places for slow worms, zone 5 elements, placing in and zones elements within zone 5 that support the wildlife and design function. So we were conscious about all of these things of client needs, and we fed all of that into our survey. And we did that before we looked at where we started to think about the site itself, because we're designing the site to meet the needs of the client. If we don't know what the needs and the goals and values of the clients are, how can we then understand the next layer of the puzzle, if you like, of our investigation? So here we go. We're now going to explore the site. What have we got? Do we have a map? That's really helpful. Are there threats that we need to think about? And just looking at California wildfires, fire as a threat. Can we bring that into our perspective, or floods as a threat? Are there challenges that we need to think about? Because if there are, we probably need to keep those at the forefront of our minds from day one. Other sites, like so in the Cultivate site, it's very visible to the public there. Are the threats that public might misuse it, steal it, or could we turn that to a positive and invite the community in, give them some ownership? I think I'll expand on sectors, but basically what size, where does the wind come from? Is the soil any good? Have we got rich soil or poor soil? Is it deep? Is it shallow? What's the community around us like? Check on the climate. Are we temperate, tropical, humid, moist, dry? The plants that are growing on the site, choosing to be there, what do they tell us? Does it tell us it was cultivated before? Does it tell us that it's very wet or very dry? There's lots of creeping buttercup and sedge grasses. The chances are it's a very wet site. We've got lots of docks and plantains. Maybe the site's very compacted. What do the indicators? Are the trees all looking like this? That maybe it's a really windy site. We can draw this information in very quickly by doing a site survey. I've tried to do site surveys when I haven't been in the place. I've tried to do it remotely. It's very difficult, but it's possible. And again, you can get the client to go away and observe things for you. Much better to be there. But we do have things like Google Maps. We do have video and cell phones and stuff. My friend Ollie, when he does site surveys, he takes a drone and he goes onto Google Maps and he draws the perimeter of the site on Google Maps, uploads that data into the drone, and then it will then fly over the site repeatedly, taking photos from every angle till it can construct a 3D map. We have technologies, we can just do all sorts of things on site surveys now that we couldn't do before. But I've also told you about A-frames and things like that. So there's many ways we can make sense of the shape of a site. Are there problems? Are we seeing erosion? Are we seeing maybe a flood, fire dangers, theft? Anything that we could identify as a thing, we just put it into the survey. In the survey, we're doing no analysis. You'll notice analysis is next. We're just literally factually recording the wind comes from the west, but today it's hot. Whatever it is, it's factual. We need to be clear about the borders and boundaries. We need to think about the microclimates, the little differences that might be within the site. Very, very, very important observation about site is water. Where does it come from? How does it arrive? How does it leave? What does it do in the meantime? Is there too much? Is there not enough? Are there times when we might have a deluge and times we might have a drought? Is water a threat? Is it an asset? Is it a limiting factor? It can be all of these things. Are there other assets lying around? I remember when we did our first survey of Cultivate, and we went there and we looked in the hedge between our garden and the site of the college next door, and what we found was a massive pile of rotting grass cuttings. As you know, grass cuttings, when put in a pile, they're too, there's not enough carbon, they're too nitrogen rich to break down properly. So what happens is it starts composting, but they break down and become like a sludge. All the oxygen gets pushed out, it pickles, and it turns to something that looks a bit like cow manure, and it'll just sit there for years, really, doesn't break down. So we saw that and thought, well, there's an asset. There's a store of nitrates that hasn't been accessed properly. So we can use that and bring that into the garden, layer it into our raised beds and release that nitrogen again. So pile of bricks, asset, pile of whatever. Often when I was doing a schools, gardens design, which is something I did as an enterprise for a little while, when we first did a survey of a school, we'd look at all the skips, we'd look in their bins. Did they have loads of cardboard, old furniture, planks, pile of bricks behind the shed? That's what we're going to build the garden out of. It's always the local and natural resources that are kicking around. Whatever's there already is what we're going to use. That's what we mean by assets. Okay, there's our survey of the land. All of this we just write down onto a sheet and we got it. There's two other really important areas of survey that we mustn't overlook. And the next one is leaks, costs. Where is useful useful material being lost? And so in many ways, the first, again, this is only survey, collecting information. We're being quite impartial, not judgmental about this information, but we're just writing it down, just noticing that that's the case. But later on, when it comes to our design, it's addressing these leaks is going to be our key area of opportunity. So in other words, produce no waste. Principle 6, produce no waste. Are we wasting time? Here's a simple example. Maybe it doesn't work in many as a generalization, but a simple example is to open a gate, which takes a second, you go through, maybe you go through that gate multiple times a day. But if the catch is broken, and so you're carrying something, every time you get to the gate, you've got to put the material down on the ground, open the catch, open the gate, pick up the material, go through, close it again. That bit of friction only takes a few seconds wasted time, but if you go through that gate 20 times a day, that ends up being multiple minutes, you know, you're spending half an hour a day opening, closing a stupid gate. That might give you an idea that there's a priority within the design is fix the gate. Do I need a gate? Maybe we can get rid of it. Could it be a turnstile? Could it be a step over thing? Could we just get a new latch? You know, this is how we approach design strategically. We remove those frictions and annoying things that perhaps, you know, could save us time. Is your soil washing away? If it is, I suggest you do something about it. If you're experiencing soil erosion, maybe you're failing to catch and store water, or you've got a labour force that aren't very well organised, that might be wasting money. There's a nutrient leaching because we're not making proper compost or something. All of these kind of closing these leaks, turning those things into feeding the energy as you're losing back into the system really helps. And that's going to be your areas where you have to best make the quickest quick win, quick return by addressing these things. But firstly, we have to identify them. And then the fourth thing that we're doing is drawing in survey experience from other people. Those things that might come from the neighbours or the people who used to live there, or the old fella down the road who remembers what it was like back in the 50s or whatever. Maybe other people have done designs. I'd like to see those. Can we go into the archive and read old newspaper stories or the parish records? Can we find out that this site previously flooded 100 years ago, or that it used to be some kind of industrial activity there that might have toxified the ground? This is knowledge that we need. I mentioned very casually when we're talking about our front garden design here at Dragons that we're aware that next door was a garage up until, I don't know when, the 50s or something. Like I had a little one of those old-fashioned petrol pumps. I had an arm that swing out into the street, and that was next door. It wasn't directly on our land, but it was next door. Was there hydrocarbon contamination into our front yard? We do not know. We couldn't afford to get the soil tested. So what we did was, and I mentioned that we constructed the beds in a way in which they're kind of isolated from the ground below them. We put a load of organic matter in the bottom of the bed. So again, there'll be a kind of a mycelial net to protect us from that. That we felt was enough. But there you go. That was observed experiences. We put that then figured that out and incorporated that in our design. So we might want to write all of that down, and that we might call that collection of survey data base map 1, and it could look like anything. And I think I showed you again some older designs that we've done and projects as students, and often base map 1's a scroll. It's fine, it's great. You're not doing that for any other purpose than for yourself. And when you come to do your design presentation at the end of the course, we want to see it. Of course we do. But it doesn't, I'm jumping ahead now, but when you do your design project or presentation and I'll say this again as well several times over, this is not an art competition or a drawing competition. I didn't really care what your drawings look like. If you've done them digitally or make them all perfect with, colors and whatever, or done it in some Photoshop or something, then great. But it doesn't matter. That's not what it's about. It's a learning process by doing it and seeing, where that gets us. So base map 1 is the output of the survey. And in an ideal world, what we would expect to do normally was we would then take base map 1 and we'd go and see our client or clients and test those observations, see if they agree, get their feedback too. Oh, look, I saw a load of nettles there. I'm kind of guessing there's fertility there, whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then you test that idea by saying inviting them to share their thoughts. You might have misinterpreted something or overlooked something or whatever. The more we get feedback, the more we test ideas against reality or against other people's experiences, then the more likely we are to be correct. Now, the next part of design, and this is the bit when we're doing it with students, is they quite often get a bit lost. And they say to me, oh, I'm not quite sure what I'm doing. And if they do come and say that, then I know that they are doing it right. Because this is a bit, you can't see the wood for the trees. This is where all you realize is you've got this ton of information now. I don't know what the hell to do with it. How do I make sense of that? And that's a bit like the caterpillar going into the chrysalis and reorganizing itself and coming out as a butterfly. All of that happens in analysis. In analysis, we're interested in functions. Well, everything that we got from our survey, we now express it in terms of functions. What are the functions of this design must fulfill to be a good design? Protection. It needs to be a demonstration and training site. There needs to be some energy features within it. We're concerned about wildlife, privacy, fertility, drainage, fuel, fodder, heat, food, cash, income, windbreak, irrigation, soil conservation. It could be so many things. How do you design for that? I don't know. Again, go back to our original, that picture that I showed you of the landscape from that book cover. And again, you can see how that very carefully ordered design is fulfilling all sorts of functions, slowing down water, reducing soil erosion, etc., etc. So obviously somebody's gone through that very carefully and identified out those functions and then thought about how to bring that into the design. So this is what we want to do is, okay, let's look at any one of these functions. Obviously, the functions from a design that you're working on will be different from the ones in this example. This is an example. Patterns to detail. When you do this for real, you encounter the detail. This is the pattern. So I wanted my design to produce food. Let's now do a brainstorm. Let's make a list of things that we might need to produce food. We know because we've spoken to the client about what their values and goals are, and their food system might include growing plants, growing trees, having things like chickens and ducks, having grazing animals, having big pasture animals, or not. They might be vegan, they might not want that. They might be really into bees, but you now know that because you've spoken to them. So what are the elements that we need to support the food systems that we know we want? Well, if it's growing veg, we're going to need water to fill up our watering cans. We're probably going to need greenhouse or a polytunnel propagation area. We're going to need a tool shed. We're going to need maybe some raised beds. We might need to think about integrated pest management, which might mean we need a pond, or we need a place where we're going to have some reptiles. Write a list. Just literally write those. Those are elements. Those elements fulfill functions. The function is growing food. The element is a spade. The element is a fork. This fork and a spade live in a tool shed. Where are we going to put that tool shed? That's part of the design. That comes later. All we know is we will need a tool shed. And in that tool shed will be your fork and your spade and your pruners and whatever else are the elements that fulfill the function of food growing. Below it says cash income. Interesting. What things might we be able to do to fulfill a cash income? Training, residential, products like fish or whatever, things to sell. Think about that. So on and so forth. So in the analysis part of our design, we're literally generating a list of elements, and it might get really boring because we might be saying the same things again and again and again. And if we've said tool shed 5 times under different headings, I'm saying you're probably going to need a tool shed. You see what I mean? You're starting now to give a form to your brainstorm, to your kind of random processes. Okay, we've got 4 minutes to go before lunch. I'm going to pause at analysis. Obviously, then the outcomes of our analysis creates a base map 2. Base map 2 usually looks like a spider diagram with lots of arrows going together, because you're showing how on the one side you've got a list of functions, on the other side you have a list of elements, and you're showing how each function, how many relationships to each element there is, and vice versa. We support key functions with multiple elements, and we choose elements that perform multiple functions. So within our analysis, we're trying to choose elements which we know will have multiple functions. So a fish pond can help support the function of income generation by having fish in it. It can help support the function of integrated pest management by encouraging other beneficial elements into the garden, bats and birds and what have you, that might regulate your insect populations. Our fish pond can be part of our water catchment and storage. It might be part of how our irrigation system is. So we've got an element, a fish pond, but it performs multiple functions. And we want to understand those relationships by exploring through them in our analysis phase. I'll try to show you I'll show you examples of this as we go through it. Try and keep it simple. Okay, I'm going to pause. And would anybody like to say anything, ask a question, give feedback, share perspectives, anything like that? I'd love to hear from you. Michelle, you're top of the list. Say something. How are you? How has any of this sort of resonate with you, and how you might approach design?
Yeah, I really like the way it's laid out. Not that particular diagram, because it's all a bit wonky wonky for my brain, so I need to redesign it so my brain finds it easier.
Yep.
But I really like having a step-by-step process that I can work my way through, because that is how my mind works. So I really like that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I do, every time I get to this bit of the thing, this is a Chris Evans diagram that he gave me when he was training me to teach permaculture. And I keep saying, I have actually done other versions of it, but I keep, for some reason, yeah, here it is. It's a bit of a headache, but it's a flow, isn't it? So yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Michelle. Yeah. Anything else?
Not immediately off the top of my head. What did you say the first base map should look like?
That it really could be a scribble. So let's say, for example, is the garden's approximately a rectangle. So I just draw a rectangle on a page. One side, that's the longest side, that's the shortest side. It can be a very rough representation. And obviously, patterns to detail. If I had a bit more time, I'll go back and measure it properly, compare it to the Google Earth map or the map that the client gave me. But when I first go, look, there's a big oak tree in the corner, there's a big ash tree up the top. It could be a bit scribbly and sketchy, because essentially it's note taking. It's not some perfectly representational, accurate ordnance survey map. Yeah. Right.
And you said base map 2 would look more a bit spider diagrammy?
Yes, because we're trying to relate functions and to elements. So the function is food growing, so the elements that might flow from that is the tool shed, the frog pond, the rainwater barrel, the germination, cold frame or something like that. So you could see literally a representation of how you're supporting the food growing function. But each one of those elements might support other functions too. So it could be, you end up with a load of lines everywhere. And the more lines, the more relationships, the better the design.
Okay.
Yeah. Sean, how are you there? How are you today? How's this for you? Making sense?
Yeah, and well, I think a bit like that anyway, because I'm a computer programmer.
Right.
I'm used to sort of designing and implementing designs and different levels of design for that purpose. And yeah, I just find it more enriching.
Good. Great. Yes. Well, I like that. Again, obviously computer programs have to fulfill function. You're going through a very deliberate sequence, aren't you? And you keep checking. It might look good, it might be really elegant, but is it actually working? And if it isn't working, you haven't fulfilled the brief.
And I've done these sort of processes for over 30 years, so I'm quite familiar with this kind of stuff, building like this, testing.
Right, you can bring that knowledge and experience and bring it into your design experiences in the natural world or whatever it is you might be doing. So
I think so.
It shows your past experiences are very relevant as well.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, thanks for that. Lindsay, anything you can add on top or anything that's making you think or not think?
No, I like this diagram. Yeah, I mean, I've done design projects in the past, so it kind of really appeals to me looking at it in this very kind of structured way.
Yeah.
And, working it out, seeing it as a set of problems to solve essentially, and then that being like a growing process, not the first stage being the very end solution, but it grows from that as well. So that's really appealing. I'm a bit unsure as to like what our kind of brief will be. Will that be something that you set up for us individually, or will it something that we choose for ourselves?
Well, it could be a bit of both.
Okay.
Like if you had a strong idea for yourself, I'd be ready to listen to it.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, I'm trying to come up with a brief to give to you because you might not have that.
I think that, yeah, when we discussed it before, you were like, maybe don't do this purely for yourself because you might kind of restrict yourself. So I don't know if it's worth finding like someone else to give me a brief, or if I would actually like a combination of the two, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. And I'm sorry I haven't got an answer right at the second.
Okay.
I'm thinking about it. I really am. And that's part of the challenge, obviously, where we're not all together at the same time and place and stuff like that. Because in essence, I always want people to collaborate together because I think that's always a good process, good experience. And of course, again, that's more how it is in the real world. You're never designing in a vacuum. You're either doing it for someone or with someone, or there's other stakeholders, or hey, can I come and help and volunteer? How do you involve those people in the process? And
yeah, and we've all got such different strengths and opinions that they will help you stop, like you say, designing in a vacuum, really. So yeah, good. Okay,
absolutely, yeah. So I'll work on all of that. And we'll come back it'll be the evening now, won't it, at 7, and we'll finish going through this, and some very nice things to think about. Oh look, there's our thing of the day, and then I keep an hour spare. I want you to have a look at the chaos theory thing, and I will post that. It's a really good watch, and it will resonate with what we've been talking about so far over the weekend as well. About how it all works. So great. I'll see you at 7. Have a lovely afternoon. Enjoy your lunch, and it was so much fun to see you all and be with you over the weekend. So thanks so much for that. I really enjoyed it, and cool.
See you later.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.